Welcome to Snooze Stories. Tonight, we journey back more than 2,000 years to a time when the world was young, when kingdoms rose and fell like waves upon an ancient shore, and when one man dared to dream of something that had never existed before, a unified empire beneath heaven. This is the story of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, a man whose name still echoes through the corridors of history, a ruler who built walls that touched the sky, who commanded armies of clay soldiers to guard his eternal sleep, and who sought to conquer not just the earth, but death itself. Before we begin, if you enjoy these historical stories, please subscribe right now and help this channel to grow. Every subscriber genuinely makes a difference for a new channel like this. And the like button pushes this video to more people who want to hear stories like these. Your support means everything. And if you have suggestions for other historical figures whose stories you'd like to hear, leave a comment below. Now, we are traveling back to ancient China, to a land of mist-covered mountains and winding rivers, of bamboo forests that whispered secrets to the wind, and of great cities where bronze bells rang out across cobblestone streets. This was a world of philosophers and warriors, of silk and jade, of poetry written in characters that looked like tiny paintings. But it was also a world at war. For centuries, China was not one nation, but many. 7 great kingdoms fought endlessly for supremacy, for resources, for survival. Armies clashed on blood-soaked fields, cities burned, dynasties crumbled. The people knew little peace, only the changing faces of their conquerors. Into this chaos, in the year 259 before the Common Era, a child was born. His name was Zheng. He entered the world not in a palace, but as a hostage in enemy territory. Few could have imagined that this boy, born under such uncertain stars, would one day become the architect of a unified China, the man who would proclaim himself the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. His story is one of ambition and brilliance, of cruelty and vision. He standardized writing, currency, and measurements across his vast realm. He connected and extended defensive walls into what would become known to the world as the Great Wall of China. He built roads and canals that knit together distant provinces. He created an army of 8,000 terracotta warriors to accompany him into the afterlife, each soldier unique, each face distinct. But he also burned books and buried scholars alive. He ruled with iron discipline and demanded absolute obedience. He became obsessed with immortality, consuming elixirs that likely hastened his death rather than prevented it. He was feared, respected, and hated in equal measure. Was he a visionary who forged a nation from warring fragments, or a tyrant whose methods left scars that lasted generations? Perhaps he was both. History rarely deals in simple truths. Tonight, we will walk beside him through every chapter of his extraordinary life, from his uncertain birth to his last sentence of emperor who believed he might never die. We will witness his conquests, his creations, his triumphs, and his terrors. Let the story unfold gently, like a scroll being carefully unrolled. Let the weight of centuries settle softly around you. There is no rush, no urgency, only the slow, patient rhythm of history revealing itself. The moon rises over ancient China. Somewhere, in a palace of red pillars and curved roofs, a young king sits planning his next conquest. Somewhere, laborers toil on a wall that will outlast them by millennia. Somewhere, clay soldiers wait in darkness, unaware that they will sleep for 2,000 years before human eyes find them again. And we are there, invisible witnesses to an age of transformation. The story of the first emperor begins now. Let us return to the 3rd century before the Common Era,
to a world on the edge of change, to the moment before everything shifted, and meet the boy who would become a legend.
To understand the first emperor, we must first understand the world that forged him, a world fractured and bleeding, a world that had forgotten what peace felt like. Close your eyes and imagine China not as the unified nation you might picture today, but as a patchwork of kingdoms, each one convinced of its own supremacy, each one willing to sacrifice thousands of lives for a few miles of territory or a strategic river crossing. This era was called the Zheng, the Warring States period. It stretched across 2.5 centuries, from about 475 to 221 before the Common Era. 250 years of nearly constant warfare. Entire generations were born, lived, and died knowing nothing but conflict. It had not always been this way. Once, long ago, there had been the Zhao dynasty, a time when kings ruled under the mandate of heaven, when ritual and tradition held society together like silk threads binding a garment. But the Zhao had weakened, their authority crumbling like ancient stone. Their kings became figureheads, powerless symbols, while real power shifted to regional lords. These lords became kings in their own right, and kings became rivals. By the time of the Warring States period, 7 major kingdoms dominated the landscape. Each had its own culture, its own dialect, its own ambitions. They were called the 7 Powers, and their names were spoken with respect and fear. Qin, Chu, Zhao, Wei, Han, Yan, and Qi. Let us visit them one by one, like a dreamer wandering through a landscape of memory. In the south sprawled Chu, vast and wealthy, its territory covering much of what is now central and southern China. Chu was a land of rivers and rice paddies, of humid summers and ancient forests. Its people were considered somewhat wild by northern standards, preserving old customs and old gods. Chu was enormous, powerful, and proud, but perhaps too confident in its own strength. To the east lay Qi, situated on fertile plains near the sea. Qi was a center of learning and commerce, its capital Linzi bustling with merchants, philosophers, and scholars. The Academy of Jixia in Qi was famous throughout the land, drawing thinkers from every kingdom. If any state could claim to be the cultural heart of China, it was Qi. But culture alone cannot stop an army. In the northeast stood Yan, the northernmost of the great powers, bordering the tribal lands beyond Chinese civilization. Yan was rugged and hardy, its people accustomed to defending against raids from the steppes. It was smaller than some of its rivals, but fiercely independent. The Central Plains held 3 kingdoms that had once been one: Han, Wei, and Zhao. These 3 had emerged from the division of the old state of Jin, like siblings born from the same parent, now eternally competing for supremacy. They shared borders, shared history, and shared animosity. Wei occupied the strategic heartland, controlling important river crossings and agricultural regions. It had been strong in earlier decades, but was now caught between powerful neighbors, slowly being squeezed. Han was the smallest of the 7 powers, vulnerable and constantly struggling to maintain its independence. It would be the first to fall, though that story lies ahead. Zhao sprawled across the northern plains and into the mountains. It was a kingdom of horsemen and archers, tough warriors accustomed to fighting both Chinese rivals and barbarian raiders from beyond the borders. Zhao would play a crucial role in our story, for it was in Zhao's capital, Handan, that a certain boy would be born.
And then there was Qin. Qin in the west. Qin in the mountains. Qin, the kingdom that others called barbarous, half-civilized, more similar to the nomadic tribes beyond China's borders than to the refined courts of the east. Qin occupied the Wei River Valley, protected by mountains and the Great Bend of the Yellow River. Its heartland was relatively isolated, separated from the central plains by mountain passes that could be easily defended. This geography made Qin difficult to invade, but it also made the other kingdoms view Qin with suspicion and disdain. The people of Qin were considered rough, uncultured. Their accent was mocked in the eastern courts. Their customs were deemed backward. When diplomats from the refined kingdoms visited Qin, they returned with tales of a harsh, militaristic society that cared little for poetry or ritual. But Qin had strengths that others underestimated. For generations, Qin's rulers had embraced a philosophy called legalism. Where other states might debate the virtues of Confucian benevolence or Taoist harmony, Qin focused on something simpler and more brutal: law, order, and power. Legalism taught that human nature was fundamentally selfish, and that only through strict laws and harsh punishments could a state achieve order. It rejected tradition in favor of pragmatism. It valued results over rhetoric, and it insisted on absolute obedience to the state. This philosophy had been implemented most thoroughly by a reformer named Shang Yang more than a century before our story begins. Lord Shang had transformed Qin from a backward frontier state into a disciplined military machine. He created a system of mutual responsibility where groups of families were held collectively accountable for any member's crimes. He abolished hereditary privilege, declaring that rank should be earned through military achievement alone. He reorganized the army, improved agriculture, and standardized punishments. Lord Shang had been brutal in his methods. The story goes that when he introduced new laws, he punished the crown prince's tutors when the prince broke them, proving that no one was above the law. Eventually, Shang Yang's own ruthlessness caught up with him. He was executed in a power struggle, ironically suffering the very harsh punishments he had created. But his system survived, and it made Qin strong. While other kingdoms might have more sophisticated culture, more beautiful poetry, more elaborate philosophical debates, Qin had something else: unity of purpose, military discipline, and an efficient state apparatus that could mobilize resources for war more effectively than any of its rivals. Qin's armies were feared. They employed mass infantry tactics, using crossbows and close-quarter weapons with devastating effectiveness. Qin's soldiers were incentivized by a brutal merit system. Heads taken in battle earned promotions, land, and status. The more enemies you killed, the higher you rose. The kingdom also benefited from its geography. Those same mountains that isolated Qin also protected it. An enemy wanting to attack Qin had to march through narrow passes where they could be ambushed and slaughtered. But when Qin armies emerged from their mountain strongholds, they could strike at the divided kingdoms of the Central Plains with surprise and force. Yet for all its military might, Qin remained, in many ways, an outsider. The other 6 kingdoms sometimes formed alliances specifically to contain Qin's expansion. They called these vertical alliances. The 6 eastern states united north to south against the western threat. Qin countered with horizontal alliances, making temporary friendships with distant kingdoms while attacking their neighbors. This strategy had a name: befriend the distant, attack the nearby. It prevented the other kingdoms from uniting effectively against Qin. This was the nature of the Warring States period. Alliances shifted like sand in wind. Today's ally became tomorrow's target. Trust was a luxury no kingdom could afford. And through all this, ordinary people suffered. Armies trampled their fields. Tax collectors took their grain. Their sons were conscripted and often never returned. Villages were burned. Families were scattered. The land itself seemed soaked in blood. Into this chaos, philosophers emerged, each offering their vision of how to restore harmony.
Confucius, who had lived before the Warring States period, had taught that society should be organized through ritual, benevolence, and proper relationships. If rulers were virtuous and people knew their place, harmony would follow. His followers traveled between courts, offering their wisdom to any king who would listen. The Taoists taught something different. They spoke of the Tao, the way, a natural order that humans disrupted with their clever schemes and artificial structures. The sage Lao Tzu had written of the power of water, which seems weak but overcomes all obstacles. He advocated for simplicity, spontaneity, and non-interference. Govern a large country as you would cook a small fish, he said, meaning carefully, with minimal handling. The Moists preached universal love and opposed aggressive warfare. They were skilled engineers who would travel to defend cities under siege, building ingenious defensive mechanisms. But their philosophy of equal love for all people seemed naive in an age of ruthless competition. And then there were the legalists. They rejected idealistic notions of human goodness. They believed that only clear laws, consistently enforced with rewards and punishments, could create order from chaos. Morality was less important than efficiency. Virtue was less valuable than obedience. It was this philosophy that had taken deepest root in Qin, and it would be this philosophy that would guide the conquest of all the others. But conquest required more than philosophy. It required brilliant generals, cunning diplomats, and ruthless determination. Most of all, it required a leader willing to dream of something unprecedented, a unified China under one ruler, one law, one vision. That leader had not yet emerged. In the 250s before the Common Era, the war dragged on as it had for generations. The seven kingdoms maneuvered, formed alliances, betrayed each other, fought, negotiated, and fought again. No one could have predicted that within a few decades, 6 of those 7 kingdoms would cease to exist. No one could have imagined that a boy not yet born, a child who would enter the world as a hostage in a foreign land, would be the one to end this age of chaos and begin a new age entirely. But the wheel of history was already turning. The pieces were moving into position. In the kingdom of Qin, plans were being laid, ambitions were growing, and in a court filled with schemers and survivors, a merchant-turned-minister named Lu Bu Wei was about to make a gamble that would change everything. The stage was set. The players were taking their positions, and soon, very soon, the boy who would become the first emperor would make his entrance into this turbulent world. But first, let us pause here at this threshold. Let the landscape of ancient China settle in your mind. The 7 kingdoms, each with its own character, each believing it might be the one to triumph. Feel the weight of 2.5 centuries of war. Sense the exhaustion of a civilization longing for unity, even as its leaders tore it further apart. The Warring States period was coming to an end, though no one yet knew it. The final act was about to begin, and in that final act, everything would change.
The year was 259 before the Common Era, in the city of Handan, capital of the kingdom of Zhao. Winter held the northern plains in its cold embrace. Snow dusted the curved roofs of courtyard houses. Breath became visible mist in the frigid air. And in a modest residence, far from the splendor of palaces, a child was born. His name was Zheng, and the circumstances of his birth were as unusual as the destiny that awaited him. To understand how a prince of Qin came to be born in the capital of a rival kingdom, we must step back a few years and meet 3 people whose ambitions and desires would intertwine to create this improbable beginning. First, there was Lu Bu Wei. Lu Bu Wei was a merchant, a man who had built enormous wealth through trade. He moved goods along the ancient networks of commerce that connected the warring kingdoms, silk from one region, jade from another, salt, iron, precious metals. He understood value. He understood investment, and he understood that the greatest investment was not in goods, but in people. Lu Bu Wei was not content to remain merely wealthy. He wanted power, influence, a place in history.
But as a merchant, he was looked down upon by the aristocracy. No matter how rich he became, he would always be considered common, low-born. The traditional paths to power were closed to him. So he sought an unconventional path. In his travels, he encountered a young man named Zichu, who would later be known as Zhuangjiang. This young man was a prince of Qin, but one with poor prospects. He was a son of the crown prince of Qin, but not the favored son, not even close. He had been sent to Zhao as a hostage, a living guarantee of peace between two kingdoms that trusted each other not at all. Being a hostage prince was a miserable existence. Zichu lived in Handan with a small retinue, given enough to survive, but little more. He was watched, constrained, neither free nor honored. When relations between Qin and Zhao deteriorated, as they frequently did, hostages suffered. They might be imprisoned, mistreated, or worse. A hostage prince was a pawn, a piece to be sacrificed if necessary. Zichu had been largely forgotten by his family back in Qin. He had many brothers, and his father, the crown prince, had numerous sons by different mothers. Zichu's own mother was not favored. His chances of ever inheriting the throne of Qin seemed almost non-existent. But Lu Bu-wei saw something others didn't, or rather he saw an opportunity where others saw only a discarded prince. The merchant approached Zichu with a proposition. Ancient historians recorded what Lu Bu-wei said, though whether these were his exact words or a later embellishment we cannot know, but the sentiment was clear. Your gate is humble, let me make it grand. Lu Bu-wei offered his fortune in making Zichu the heir to Qin's throne. It was an audacious plan, a gamble worthy of a merchant who understood risk and reward. If it succeeded, Lu Bu-wei would become the power behind the throne, the man who made a king. If it failed, well, merchants knew how to accept losses. Zichu, desperate and hopeful, agreed.
Lu Bu-wei began spending lavishly. He used his wealth to cultivate connections in Qin's court. He sent gifts, made arrangements, whispered in the right ears. Most crucially, he befriended Lady Huayang, the favorite consort of Zichu's father, the crown prince of Qin. Lady Huayang had no sons of her own, and Lu Bu-wei convinced her to adopt Zichu as her son, making him a potential heir. It was a masterful piece of political maneuvering, but there was another element to this story, one shrouded in mystery and scandal. Lu Bu-wei had a consort of his own, a woman of remarkable beauty. Her family name was Zhao, and history remembers her as Lady Zhao, though some sources call her Zhao Ji. She danced at Lu Bu-wei's parties and was said to be the merchant's favorite companion. According to the ancient historian Sima Chen, who wrote about these events more than a century later, something extraordinary happened. Zichu saw Lady Zhao at one of Lu Bu-wei's gatherings and became infatuated with her. He asked Lu Bu-wei if he might have her as his own consort. Now here, the historical record becomes murky, filtering fact through the haze of time and political bias. Sima Chen claimed that Lady Zhao was already pregnant with Lu Bu-wei's child when the merchant gave her to Zichu. That Lu Bu-wei concealed this fact, making Zichu believe the child was his own. If this account is true, then Zheng, the future first emperor of China, was not actually the son of a prince, but the son of a merchant. It would mean the entire Qin imperial line began with deception. But was it true? We cannot know with certainty. Sima Chen wrote during the Han dynasty, which came to power after Qin's fall. The Han had every reason to delegitimize the Qin emperors, to paint the first emperor's origins as tainted and improper. The story might have been invented or exaggerated to cast doubt on Qin Shi Huang's legitimacy. Or it might have been true. History keeps its secrets. What we know for certain is this.
Lady Zhao became Zichu's consort, and in the first month of 259 before the Common Era, in the city of Handan, she gave birth to a son. They named him Ying Zheng, using the family name of Qin's ruling house. The baby entered a world of uncertainty. Handan was enemy territory, and his very existence depended on delicate political balances that could shift at any moment. That same year, the relationship between Qin and Zhao deteriorated sharply. Qin forces laid siege to Handan, the very city where the infant Ying Zheng lay in his cradle. Armies surrounded the walls, siege towers were built. The people of Handan prepared to resist. For little Ying Zheng, the timing could hardly have been worse. The people of Zhao knew he was a prince of Qin. As Qin soldiers attacked their walls, it would have been natural to take vengeance on the enemy prince living in their midst. The child and his father were in mortal danger. Lu Buwei, ever resourceful, arranged their escape. Using his wealth and connections, he managed to smuggle Zichu out of Handan and back to Qin. But he could not save everyone. Lady Zhao and the infant Ying Zheng were left behind. Imagine those early years of childhood hidden in a hostile city. Lady Zhao had to conceal her son's identity or at least minimize attention. They lived modestly, perhaps in poverty, certainly in fear. Every knock at the door might be soldiers coming to arrest them. Every stranger might be an informer. The boy grew in shadows, learning caution before he learned to speak clearly. He breathed the air of a city that had reason to hate his very existence. He likely witnessed the hardships of siege, the suffering of civilians caught in the machinery of war. These experiences would shape him. How could they not? While other princes grew up in palaces, surrounded by luxury and servants attending their every need, Ying Zheng learned about vulnerability, about being powerless in a world of powerful forces. Meanwhile, in Qin, remarkable things were happening. Lu Buwei's gamble was paying off. Through a series of deaths and political maneuverings, Zichu's position improved. When Qin's king died and Zichu's father ascended the throne, Zichu became crown prince, and when his father died after reigning only 3 days, Zichu himself became king.
It was an astonishing rise. The forgotten hostage prince, the man with no prospects, now sat on the throne of Qin as King Zhongxiang. And suddenly, the boy in Handan became important. He was the son of a king, the heir to Qin. Arrangements were made, diplomatic channels opened. Whatever animosity existed between Qin and Zhao, both sides recognized the value of retrieving a royal heir. After years of hiding, after years of uncertainty and fear, Lady Zhao and young Ying Zheng were finally allowed to return to Qin. The boy was perhaps 9 years old when he left Handan. He had spent his entire childhood as a hostage, though perhaps he barely understood what that meant. All he knew was that he was going home, to a place he had never seen, to meet a father he barely remembered, to enter a life completely different from anything he had known. The journey from Zhao to Qin must have been overwhelming, crossing mountains, following ancient roads, moving from the familiar into the unknown. His mother beside him, equally uncertain, both of them aware that everything was changing. When they arrived in Qin's capital, Ying Zheng entered a world of power and danger far more subtle and complex than anything in Handan. He was a prince now, officially recognized as heir to the throne, but he was also a stranger in his own kingdom, a boy who had grown up in enemy territory, who spoke with an accent that might have sounded foreign to Qin ears. And always there was the shadow of Lu Buwei, the merchant who had orchestrated everything, the man who treated princes like investments, the man who might or might not be Ying Zheng's true father. Lu Buwei had achieved what he wanted. He became chancellor, the most powerful minister in Qin.
He whispered in Ying's ear. He shaped policy. He had successfully transformed himself from merchant to kingmaker. But King Xiangxiang's health was poor. He had endured hard years as a hostage, and they had taken their toll. He reigned for only 3 years before illness claimed him. In the year 246 before the Common Era, King Xiangxiang died, and Ying Zheng, at the age of 13, became king of Qin. A child king, an heir shaped by years as a hostage, a boy who had known fear and uncertainty, who had seen the brutality of war from the vulnerable side, who had learned to hide and survive before he learned to rule. This was not the typical education of a conqueror, but perhaps it was exactly the education he needed. The boy had become a king, but he was not yet ready to rule. Others would guide him, shape him, use him for their own purposes, and at the center of everything, manipulating events with practiced skill, stood Lu Bu Wei, the merchant who had gambled on a prince and won a kingdom. The question now was, who would ultimately control whom? Would young Ying Zheng remain a pawn in Lu Bu Wei's game, or would the boy reveal strengths that no one had anticipated? The answers would unfold slowly, across years of regency and growing power, but already in that 13-year-old king, something was stirring. Ambition, perhaps, or vision, or simply the will to survive that he had learned in the hostile streets of Handan. The first emperor was not born in a day. He was forged across years, shaped by circumstances, hardened by experience, and his forging had only just begun.
13 years old, an age when most children are still learning the world, still discovering who they might become. But for Ying Zheng, 13 was the age when the weight of a kingdom settled upon his shoulders. The coronation ceremonies were elaborate, as befitted the ascension of a new king. Ritual had always been important in Chinese courts, a way of connecting the present to the ancient past, of legitimizing power through tradition. Young Ying Zheng would have been dressed in ceremonial robes, their silk heavy with embroidered dragons and symbolic patterns. He would have performed the prescribed movements, spoken the required words, accepted the jade seal that marked royal authority. But ceremony could not change the fundamental reality. He was a child, and children do not truly rule. Power, real power, resided elsewhere. It resided with Lu Bu Wei. The merchant-turned-chancellor became regent in all but name. He had orchestrated this outcome, invested years and fortune to reach this moment. Now he stood as the true power behind Qin's throne, governing in the young king's name, while Ying Zheng learned what it meant to be a ruler. Lu Bu Wei was, by all accounts, a capable administrator. He understood statecraft, diplomacy, and the mechanics of power. Under his guidance, Qin continued its slow, methodical expansion. Wars were waged, territories conquered, alliances formed and broken. The great project of unifying China ground forward, though no one yet called it that. But capable administrator or not, Lu Bu Wei was also a man of appetites and ambitions. And here we must tread carefully through another murky chapter of history, another scandal that may be truth or invention or something in between. Remember Lady Zhao, the young king's mother? She was still young herself, widowed now, living in the palace with all the luxury that had been denied her in Handan. According to the histories, Lu Bu Wei resumed his relationship with her. The man who might be the king's true father, the man who had given Lady Zhao to Zichu years ago, now became her lover again. If this seems improper, even scandalous, it was. The Dowager Queen taking the Chancellor as her lover while her son sat on the throne was the stuff of court gossip and political danger. But Lu Bu Wei wielded enormous power, and Lady Zhao was presumably discreet. Yet this situation could not last indefinitely. As Ying Zheng grew older, the risk increased. The boy king would not remain a boy forever. Eventually, he would begin to assert his own authority, and when that happened, how would he view his mother's relationship with the Chancellor?
According to the histories, Lu Bue decided to extract himself from this dangerous entanglement. He introduced Lady Zhao to another man, a figure even more scandalous than himself, Lao Ai. Lao Ai was, if the ancient sources are to be believed, chosen specifically for his physical attributes. The details recorded by Sima Qian are explicit and somewhat absurd. Stories of Lao Ai's supposed abilities became the subject of ribald court gossip. Lu Bue apparently arranged for Lao Ai to be presented as a eunuch, falsely castrated, so he could serve in the Queen Mother's household without suspicion. Lady Zhao became infatuated. She had Lao Ai appointed to positions of increasing importance. She showered him with honors and wealth, and in time she bore him 2 sons, in secret, away from court. All of this was happening while young Ying Zheng was learning to be a king. Can you imagine what those years were like for him? The palace intrigue swirling around him, the plots and schemes and hidden affairs. He was king in name, but others made the decisions. He participated in state rituals, received foreign envoys, sat on the throne during audiences, but the real business of governing happened in chambers where he was not present, in conversations he was not part of. But he was learning, watching, absorbing. Among his tutors and advisors was a man who would become perhaps the most important influence on his reign, Li Si. Li Si came from the kingdom of Chu, born to humble circumstances. He had been a minor clerk in his youth, but possessed a brilliant mind and towering ambition. He studied under the philosopher Xunzi, a Confucian thinker with a darker view of human nature than most. Xunzi taught that people were inherently selfish and required strict education and social structures to become good. This teaching aligned well with legalist philosophy, and Li Si became a devoted legalist. He believed that a truly great state required absolute authority, clear laws, and the ruthless application of power. Virtue was less important than order. Tradition should yield to effectiveness.
Li Si had come to Qin because he recognized that Qin was where the future would be made. Other kingdoms might have richer culture or more ancient lineages, but Qin had system, discipline, and momentum. Li Si wanted to be part of that momentum. He wanted to help create something unprecedented. He found his way into Lu Bue's circle and eventually became one of young Ying Zheng's tutors. We can imagine their lessons together, Li Si explaining the principles of legalist governance, telling the young king about the reforms of Lord Shang, about how strict laws and harsh punishments could transform a weak state into a powerful one. But Li Si taught more than philosophy. He taught practical statecraft, how to assess advisors, how to evaluate military situations, how to recognize when people were being truthful and when they were flattering, how to project authority even when you felt uncertain. The young king absorbed these lessons. He was intelligent, perceptive. The years in Handan had taught him to read situations, to sense danger, to understand that the world was not gentle. Now Li Si was giving him the intellectual framework to transform survival instincts into political philosophy. Other tutors contributed to his education as well. He learned military strategy, studied the campaigns of famous generals, learned to read maps and understand terrain. He studied the classics, learned the histories of the Zhou dynasty and the legends of ancient sage kings. He practiced calligraphy, learning to write the complex characters that carried meaning and beauty in every stroke. He also learned about the other kingdoms, their strengths, their weaknesses, their internal politics. Qin's intelligence network was extensive, and reports flowed constantly into the capital. Which kingdoms were allied, which were feuding, who were the capable generals in Zhou or Chu, what resources did Wei control. All of this information was digested, analyzed, stored away in the young king's growing understanding of the world he would one day control. But knowledge alone does not make a ruler. Power requires will. It requires the ability to make hard decisions and accept their consequences. It requires the capacity to be ruthless when ruthlessness is necessary.
These qualities were developing in Zheng during his regency years, though perhaps no one fully recognized it yet. He was still the boy king, still overshadowed by Lu Buwei's authority, still silent during council meetings while others debated strategy. But he was watching, always watching. He watched Lu Buwei govern, and he learned how power worked, how a chancellor could control information, could place allies in key positions, could slowly accumulate authority until the king became almost irrelevant. He watched the nobles at court, saw how they jockeyed for position, formed factions, made alliances. He learned who could be trusted and who required careful watching. He saw how military victories enhanced prestige, how successful generals became popular and therefore potentially dangerous. He observed how rewards and punishments motivated behavior, just as Li Si taught. And slowly, quietly, he began to build his own network. He identified capable men, people loyal to him rather than to Lu Buwei. He cultivated relationships with key military officers. He listened to younger officials who might rise to prominence in the future. He was preparing. For what exactly he might not yet have fully articulated, but some instinct told him that he could not remain a figurehead forever, that eventually he would need to truly rule. And when that moment came, he would need allies, resources, and most of all, the will to act. The palace itself was both his home and his cage. Its courtyards and gardens might have been beautiful, its halls decorated with silk and jade, but they were also spaces of constant surveillance. Every word could be reported, every action observed. A king, even a young one, was never truly alone. Did he have friends? True companions? The historical record is silent on this. Perhaps he learned early that friendship was a luxury kings could not afford. Or perhaps there were a few trusted individuals, companions from childhood, people who knew him as Zheng rather than as king.
We know he took an interest in the world beyond the palace walls. Despite the grandeur of court life, he wanted to understand how ordinary people lived, how soldiers felt about their commanders, how farmers viewed the endless demands for taxes and conscription. This curiosity would serve him well in the future. Many rulers remained isolated in their palaces, making decisions based on theory or what advisors told them. Zheng was developing a more practical understanding, a sense of the mechanisms that actually made a kingdom function. The years passed. 13 became 14, then 15, then 16. With each year, the boy king grew taller, stronger, more confident. His voice deepened, his understanding sharpened. And with each year, the question became more pressing. When would he take real power? Lu Buwei likely wondered this himself. The chancellor had served loyally, had governed well, had continued Qin's expansion, but he must have known that this arrangement could not last forever. A young man, especially one as intelligent as Zheng was proving to be, would eventually chafe under another's authority. The situation with Lao Ai was also becoming increasingly unstable. The Queen Mother's lover had grown arrogant with his accumulation of wealth and titles. He walked through the palace as if he were royalty himself. He had fathered 2 sons with Lady Zhao, and though this was kept secret, such secrets rarely remained hidden forever. Lao Ai apparently began to believe his own propaganda. He started to imagine that perhaps if the young king were to die or be removed, he might place one of his own sons on the throne. He began gathering followers, building a private army of sorts. It was a dangerous fantasy, and it would soon shatter spectacularly. But that crisis still lay ahead. For now, in these years of regency, young Zheng was still learning, still growing, still preparing. He studied the maps of the warring kingdoms, memorizing their borders, their capitals, their strategic strongpoints. He listened to reports of battles won and lost. He learned which arguments worked in council meetings, which advisors could be swayed by logic and which by self-interest. He also learned about himself, what he was capable of, what he was willing to do to achieve his goals. The boy who had been born in enemy territory, who had hidden in Handan while siege engines battered the walls, was becoming someone new,
someone harder, more focused, more ambitious. The formative years were coming to an end. Soon, very soon, he would need to act, to claim his throne not just in name but in reality, to prove that he was not a figurehead for others to manipulate, but a king in his own right. And when that moment came, the court would discover that the boy they had underestimated was far more formidable than anyone had imagined. Li Si would later write that a great ruler must sometimes do what seems cruel to achieve lasting peace, that harsh measures in the present can prevent greater suffering in the future. That sentiment, that calculation, was taking root in Zheng during these years. He was learning to think like an emperor, even if that title did not yet exist. He was preparing to reshape not just Qin, but all of China. He was becoming the man who would build walls that touched the sky, who would burn books and bury scholars, who would conquer death itself or die trying. But first, he had to escape the shadows of regency. He had to claim his power, and the opportunity to do so was approaching faster than anyone realized.
The year was 238 before the Common Era. Zheng was 21 years old, no longer a child by any measure. According to the customs of the time, he had reached the age when he should perform the ceremony of manhood, the capping ritual that would mark his transition to full adulthood. This ceremony was more than mere tradition. It carried political weight. Once a king underwent the capping ceremony, he was formally recognized as an adult ruler. Regents were expected to step aside. The king would rule in his own name, make his own decisions, command his own authority. For Zheng, this ceremony represented the threshold he had been approaching for years. Everything he had learned, all his careful preparation, all the networks he had quietly built, now was the time to use them. But others recognized the significance as well, and not everyone was prepared to surrender power peacefully. Lao Wei, the Queen Mother's lover, had grown increasingly reckless. He had accumulated wealth that rivaled the royal treasury. He commanded thousands of retainers who owed loyalty to him personally. He walked through the palace with an entourage fit for a king, and most dangerously, he had convinced himself that he could challenge the young king's authority. Perhaps he believed that Lady Zhao's influence would protect him. Perhaps he thought his private army was strong enough to seize control. Or perhaps, most likely, he panicked when he realized that Zheng's coming of age would end the special privileges and unchecked power he had enjoyed. Whatever his reasoning, Lao Wei made a catastrophic decision. He decided to rebel. The details of his plot are somewhat unclear in the historical sources, but the broad outline is known. Lao Wei forged the royal seal and issued false orders, attempting to mobilize troops loyal to himself. He planned to attack the palace, presumably to kill or imprison the young king and install one of his own sons with Lady Zhao as the new ruler. It was an audacious plan. It was also poorly conceived and badly executed. Zheng's intelligence network had been watching Lao Wei. The young king was no longer the naive child who could be manipulated or kept ignorant. He knew about the rebellion before Lao Wei's forces could fully mobilize. The response was swift and decisive. Royal troops moved against Lao Wei's forces. There was fighting in the capital's streets, unusual for a society where battles typically happened on distant frontiers. The clash was brief but violent. Lao Wei's followers, realizing they faced the full might of the state, began to scatter or surrender. Lao Wei himself attempted to flee, but he was captured within days. The punishment was severe, designed to send an unmistakable message. Lao Wei was executed in a manner reserved for the worst traitors, torn apart by 5 chariots, each pulling a different limb. It was called the 5 punishment death, a horrible end meant to obliterate not just the person, but the very idea of challenging royal authority.
His followers were hunted down. Some were executed. Others had their families destroyed, entire clans eliminated to ensure no one could later seek revenge. Thousands died in the purge that followed. And the two sons that Lao Wei had fathered with Lady Zhao? The historical record states simply that they were killed. They were children, innocent of their father's crimes, but in the brutal calculus of power, they represented a potential future threat. As long as they lived, someone might try to use them to challenge Ying Zheng's legitimacy. The young king did not flinch from this decision. Whether it caused him private anguish, we cannot know, but publicly he showed no hesitation. The children died. Lady Zhao, his own mother, was placed under house arrest. The woman who had hidden with him in Handan, who had protected him through those dangerous early years, was now isolated, her political influence destroyed. She would never again wield power in court. The message was clear. Family ties meant nothing when weighed against the stability of the state. Sentiment was a luxury. Power required hard choices. But Lao Wei's rebellion was only the first crisis. The more delicate problem was Lu Bu Wei.
The Chancellor had not been directly involved in Lao Wei's plot, but neither was he entirely innocent. After all, he had introduced Lao Wei to Lady Zhao in first place. He had allowed the situation to develop, perhaps thinking he could control it. At minimum, he had been negligent. At worst, he might have been complicit in ways the historical record does not clearly reveal. Moreover, Lu Bu Wei represented something that Ying Zheng could no longer tolerate, an alternative center of power. The Chancellor had his own network of followers, his own base of support, ministers and generals who owed their positions to Lu Bu Wei's patronage, people throughout the government who looked to the Chancellor for guidance rather than to the king. This could not continue. But removing Lu Bu Wei was far more complicated than crushing Lao Wei's crude rebellion. Lu Bu Wei was respected, even beloved by many. He had governed competently for years. He had connections throughout the kingdom and in foreign courts. He was not some upstart nobody who could be casually eliminated. He was, in many ways, the architect of Qin's recent successes. And there was always that shadow of that old question: was Ying Zheng's true father? If the rumors were true, if Lu Bu Wei had indeed fathered the king, then killing him would be parricide, one of the gravest crimes in Chinese culture. Even if the rumors were false, they existed. People whispered, and the king's enemies could use such whispers to undermine his legitimacy. Ying Zheng chose a careful path. He did not execute Lu Bu Wei. Instead, he began to strip away the Chancellor's power piece by piece. First, Lu Bu Wei was dismissed from his position as Chancellor. The official reason was vague, perhaps the need for new leadership, perhaps the Chancellor's advanced age, but everyone understood the real message. Then, Lu Bu Wei was ordered to leave the capital. He was assigned to a distant province, ostensibly as a governor, but really as a form of exile. He went, taking his household with him, suddenly reduced from the most powerful man in Qin to just another provincial administrator. But even in exile, Lu Bu Wei remained dangerous. Foreign envoys still visited him, seeking his advice. Nobles sent him letters. He maintained connections, influence. As long as he lived, he represented the possibility of a challenge to the king's authority. Letters began arriving from the capital. At first, they were merely cool, formal communications. Then they became pointed, asking why foreign dignitaries continued to seek Lu Bu Wei's counsel, suggesting that such attention was inappropriate, implying that the former chancellor might be conspiring with foreign powers. The message was unmistakable. You are no longer welcome. You have no future. And if you persist in remaining relevant, you will be treated as a threat. Lu Bu Wei, merchant and kingmaker, man who had gambled on an obscure prince and nearly won an empire, understood. He had played the game of power at the highest levels. He knew when a hand was lost. In the year 235 before the Common Era, Lu Bu Wei drank poison and died. Some sources suggest it was suicide, a final act of dignity before he could be formally executed. Others hint that the poison was administered on royal orders, made to look like suicide.
The truth, as so often in these ancient intrigues, remains hidden beneath layers of time and politically motivated histories. What matters is the result. Lu Buwei was gone. The last regent, the last alternative source of authority, was removed from the board. Ying Zheng, at 25 years old, finally ruled Qin without rivals, without handlers, without anyone standing between himself and absolute power. He immediately began reorganizing the government. Ministers who had been too closely associated with Lu Buwei were replaced. New men, chosen for competence and loyalty to the king personally, rose to positions of authority.
Li Si, his former tutor, became one of his most trusted advisors. Li Si's legalist principles aligned perfectly with Ying Zheng's vision. Where Confucians spoke of virtue and benevolence, Li Si spoke of laws and systems. Where traditionalists wanted to preserve ancient customs, Li Si advocated for ruthless pragmatism. The military was also reformed. Generals were evaluated based on results, not lineage. The merit system that Qin had pioneered under Lord Shang was reinforced and expanded. A soldier who showed courage and skill could rise. A noble who proved incompetent would fall. This meritocratic approach had revolutionary implications. In the other kingdoms, military command was largely the province of aristocratic families. Generals inherited their positions or received them through connections. But in Qin, increasingly, the best fighters led. The most capable strategists commanded. It made Qin's armies more effective. It also made them more loyal to the system, and therefore to the king who embodied that system. Ying Zheng also began to personally involve himself in military planning. He studied reports from the frontiers, reviewed maps, consulted with generals. He wanted to understand every aspect of Qin's military capabilities. Because he had a vision now, fully formed and breathtaking in its ambition. He would conquer the other 6 kingdoms, all of them. He would unite China under Qin's rule. He would end the Warring States period not through negotiation or alliance, but through absolute victory. It had never been done. No one had ever unified all of China. The Zhou dynasty had nominally ruled a united realm, but in reality, they had presided over a feudal system where regional lords held real power. What Ying Zheng envisioned was different. True unification. One law, one ruler, one empire. His advisors might have thought it impossible. The other kingdoms were powerful, their armies formidable. Chu alone was enormous, its territory and population rivaling Qin's. The 6 kingdoms could, if they truly united against Qin, potentially overwhelm it. But Ying Zheng had spent his childhood and youth studying these kingdoms, learning their weaknesses, understanding their divisions. He knew they would not unite effectively. Their mutual suspicions ran too deep. Their competing interests kept them fragmented. And Qin had advantages that would prove decisive. Its legalist system made it more efficient. Its meritocratic army was more motivated. Its centralized government could mobilize resources more effectively than the aristocratic bureaucracies of the other kingdoms. Most importantly, Qin now had a leader who was utterly committed to conquest. A king who would devote all his energy, all his will, all the resources of his state to achieving this unprecedented goal. The young man who had once hidden in Handan, who had survived as a hostage, who had endured years as a figurehead king, had emerged as something new, something China had never quite seen before. He was no longer Ying Zheng the boy. He was becoming Qin Shi Huang, though that title still lay in the future, waiting to be claimed. But first, the conquests. First, the wars. First, the systematic destruction of the old order and the creation of something entirely new. The other kingdoms did not yet realize what was coming. They saw Qin as they always had. Powerful, yes. Dangerous, certainly. But just another player in the endless game of shifting alliances and limited warfare. They did not understand that the game had changed, that this new king of Qin was playing for different stakes entirely. Not for advantage, not for territory, not for the usual prizes of the Warring States period. He was playing for everything.
for all of China, for history itself. The stage was set, the pieces were in position. The obstacles to his power had been removed, sometimes through political maneuvering, sometimes through violence, but always with cold calculation. Now came the real test, the conquests that would span decades, the military campaigns that would reshape the map of China, the slow, brutal, brilliant destruction of 6 ancient kingdoms and the forging of an empire. Ying had seized power within his own kingdom. Now he would reach for power over all the kingdoms, and he would not stop until every one of them had fallen, until the last enemy king had surrendered, until China stood unified under his command. The wars of unification were about to begin.
War is not merely about soldiers clashing on fields of battle. That is the visible part, the dramatic moment that captures attention. But beneath the surface of every campaign lies something deeper: strategy, logistics, diplomacy, deception, the careful preparation that makes victory possible before the first arrow flies. Zheng understood this. He had studied warfare not as a romantic adventure, but as a science, a craft that could be mastered through careful analysis and ruthless execution. And he had at his disposal the most sophisticated military machine that China had yet seen. The Qin army was extraordinary, and to understand how the 6 kingdoms fell, we must first understand the weapon that would bring them down. Let us begin with numbers. At its height, Qin could field armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, but size alone did not make Qin's military superior. Other kingdoms could also raise large forces. What made Qin different was organization, discipline, and motivation. The foundation of Qin's military strength was its system of universal conscription. Every able-bodied man owed military service to the state. This was not unusual in itself. The other kingdoms also drafted soldiers. But Qin's system was more thorough, more efficiently managed. Men were organized into units with clear chains of command. Each soldier knew his place, his role, his responsibilities. Officers were promoted based on merit and battlefield success, not family connections. This created a meritocracy where the most capable rose to command regardless of birth. The incentive structure was brutal but effective. Soldiers were rewarded based on the number of enemy heads they took in battle. Each head meant a promotion in rank, grants of land, tax exemptions. The more enemies you killed, the higher you rose in society. This created an army of men fighting not just for their kingdom, but for personal advancement. Each battle was an opportunity to improve one's station, to rise from peasant to landholder, from nobody to somebody. It made Qin's soldiers ferocious, relentless. The punishments for cowardice or failure were equally severe. Units that retreated without orders could be decimated, literally with 1 in every 10 soldiers executed. Commanders who lost battles without good reason faced execution or disgrace. The message was clear: victory or death. But discipline and motivation meant little without proper equipment and logistics. Here again, Qin excelled. The state operated arsenals that produced weapons in massive quantities: bronze swords, spears, halberds, and most importantly, crossbows. The Qin crossbow was a marvel of engineering, capable of piercing armor at considerable distance. It could be operated by a soldier with minimal training, unlike the traditional bow, which required years to master. Crossbowmen could stand in ranks and fire volleys that devastated enemy formations. The psychological effect was profound. Imagine facing a wall of soldiers, hearing the mechanical click of hundreds of crossbows being cocked, then watching the sky darken with bolts. Armor was standardized, produced in sizes that could fit most soldiers. This allowed for rapid equipment of new troops and easy replacement of damaged gear. The supply system was sophisticated, with dedicated units responsible for transporting food, weapons, and equipment to armies in the field. Roads built throughout Qin's territory allowed for rapid troop movement. Intelligence networks provided information about enemy dispositions. Medical corps treated wounded soldiers, increasing the chance they could return to fight again. It was warfare as systematic process, refined across decades of experience. But an army, no matter how well organized, required leadership. And here, Zheng proved remarkably skilled at identifying and utilizing talented commanders.
Among his generals, two names stand above all others: Wang Zhan and Men Tian. Wang Zhan was already a seasoned commander when Ying took full power. He came from a military family and had proven himself in numerous campaigns. What distinguished Wang Zhan was not flashy brilliance or daring cavalry charges, but methodical competence and deep understanding of logistics. Wang Zhan knew that wars were won as much by supply lines as by tactics, that an army that could sustain itself in enemy territory, that could keep its soldiers fed and equipped month after month, would eventually triumph over a more glamorous but less prepared force. He was cautious, some might even say conservative. He would not be rushed into battle. When assigned a campaign, he would take time to prepare thoroughly, to position his forces correctly, to ensure supply routes were secure. Only then would he engage. This cautiousness frustrated some, but Ying recognized its value. Wang Zhan delivered victories, perhaps not quickly, but reliably. And in a decades-long campaign of conquest, reliability mattered more than speed. Wang Zhan had another quality that the king valued. He was not politically ambitious. He did not seek power beyond his military commands. He served loyally, executed orders efficiently, and did not involve himself in court intrigues. For a king who had just removed regents and crushed a rebellion, such loyalty was precious. Men Tian represented a different type of general. Younger than Wang Zhan, he came from a family with a distinguished military tradition. His grandfather had served with distinction. His father had been a general, and Men Tian inherited their skill and reputation. Where Wang Zhan was methodical, Men Tian was versatile. He proved capable in both conventional warfare and in the specialized task of frontier defense. He understood siege warfare, open battle, and the unique challenges of fighting in mountainous or difficult terrain. Men Tian would later become famous for overseeing the connection and extension of the Great Wall, managing massive construction projects that required military precision and organizational genius. But in these years of conquest, he was one of the key commanders bringing down the Six Kingdoms. The king trusted these men, but he also watched them carefully. He had learned from history that successful generals could become threats. An army that was more loyal to its general than to the king represented a danger. So Ying balanced his generals against each other. He rotated commands, ensuring no single general controlled the same army indefinitely. He maintained direct communication with subordinate officers, creating multiple channels of information. He rewarded success lavishly, but also reminded everyone where ultimate authority resided. It was a delicate balance, but he managed it well. Throughout the wars of unification, none of his major generals betrayed him or attempted to seize power for themselves. But military strength alone could not conquer Six Kingdoms. Strategy was equally important. And here, Ying and his advisors employed a sophisticated approach that combined warfare, diplomacy, and psychological manipulation. The core strategic principle was one that Qin had used before: befriend the distant, attack the nearby. In Chinese, this was called Yuan Zhao Jin Geng. Make alliances with kingdoms far from your borders while conquering those close at hand. The logic was elegant. If you attack a neighbor, that neighbor's neighbors might come to their aid, unless you've already made those neighbors your friends.
By offering generous terms to distant kingdoms, by sending gifts and making alliances, you prevent the formation of a unified coalition against you. So Qin would ally with Qi in the Far East while attacking Wei in the Central Plains, or maintain friendly relations with Yan in the Northeast while crushing Zhao. The distant allies, reassured by diplomatic overtures and perhaps secretly pleased to see a rival weakened, would not intervene. By the time it was their turn to be attacked, their potential allies were already conquered or too weak to help. This strategy required skilled diplomats, men who could move between courts, who understood the complex web of relationships and rivalries that bound the warring kingdoms together.
Qin's diplomatic corps was well-funded and well-trained. Envoys carried generous gifts: jade, silk, gold, fine horses. They flattered foreign rulers, played on their fears and ambitions, made promises that might or might not be kept. They also employed spies and spread disinformation. Rumors could be as deadly as arrows. A whispered suggestion that a kingdom's best general was planning betrayal might lead that kingdom to execute their own defender. False reports of Qin armies massing in one location could draw enemy forces away from the actual target. Deception was considered a legitimate tool of warfare. The ancient military treatise, The Art of War by Sun Tzu, taught that all warfare is based on deception. Qin's strategists had absorbed this lesson thoroughly. They would feign weakness to draw enemies into traps. They would pretend to retreat, luring pursuers into ambushes. They would send false deserters to enemy camps carrying misinformation. They would bribe officials in enemy kingdoms to provide intelligence or even to sabotage their own state's defenses. Gold could accomplish what armies could not. A well-placed bribe might open a city gate that would have cost thousands of lives to breach. A corrupted general might withdraw at a crucial moment, turning a defensive victory into a rout. Was this honorable? By modern standards, perhaps not. But Ying was not concerned with abstract notions of honor. He was concerned with results, with victory, with the unification of China under Qin's rule. Li Si, his chief advisor, would articulate the philosophy clearly. The end justifies the means. If deception and bribery prevented battles, they actually saved lives. If ruthless tactics shortened wars, they reduced overall suffering. A kingdom conquered quickly and efficiently would suffer less than one that resisted for years. This was legalist thinking at its most pure. Morality was subordinate to effectiveness. What worked was right. What achieved the state's goals was justified. Under this philosophy, Qin's campaigns took on a systematic quality. Before attacking a kingdom, intelligence would be gathered. Which officials could be bribed? Which generals were competent and which were vain or incompetent? What were the kingdom's internal divisions? Which noble families were feuding? Diplomatic missions would be sent to the target's enemies, offering alliance or at least neutrality. Gold would flow to potential collaborators within the target kingdom. Spies would infiltrate court and military. Only then would the armies march, and when they did, they often found that the groundwork had already been laid for victory. Gates opened from within. Generals mysteriously failed to appear for crucial battles. Court intrigue paralyzed decision-making at critical moments. The conquests, when we examine them closely, were not just military triumphs. They were the result of years of preparation, of patient work laying foundations, of careful manipulation of circumstances until victory became almost inevitable. This methodical approach meant that the wars of unification, while spread across years, were in some ways more efficient than they might have been. Battles were fought, yes, and many died, but the death toll was perhaps lower than it would have been if Qin had relied solely on brute military force. At least, that was how Ying and his advisors justified their methods. Whether the conquered kingdoms saw it the same way is another question. The king himself was involved in strategic planning at the highest levels. He met regularly with his generals and advisors, reviewing maps, discussing approaches, allocating resources. He understood that as king, he could not personally lead armies into battle. His presence was needed in the capital, maintaining the system that made conquest possible.
But he demanded detailed reports. He wanted to understand why each decision was made. He questioned assumptions and challenged strategies. His generals learned that he was not a figurehead who rubber-stamped their plans, but an active participant who expected excellence. This combination, military excellence, strategic sophistication, diplomatic cunning, and ruthless execution, this was the machinery that would conquer China. 6 kingdoms stood in its path, each with its own history, culture, pride. Each convinced of its own strength and legitimacy. Each believing it could resist or negotiate or somehow survive. They were all wrong. One by one, systematically, relentlessly, they would fall. Like dominoes carefully positioned, each collapse making the next easier. The great kingdoms that had warred for centuries, that had seemed permanent features of the Chinese landscape, would be erased from the map. And in their place would stand something new, something that had never existed before. But that transformation lay ahead in the campaigns we will explore next. For now, understand this: the conquests were not accidents or lucky breaks. They were the result of systematic preparation, of a war machine refined across generations, led by a king who would accept nothing less than total victory. The art of conquest, as Qin practiced it, was not merely about destroying enemies. It was about building a system so effective, so efficient, so overwhelming that resistance itself became futile. And that system, guided by the will of one man, was about to reshape the world.
Imagine a map of ancient China, spread across a table in the king's chamber. 6 colors marking 6 kingdoms, each one a world unto itself. Each with cities and farms, temples and palaces, millions of people living lives that seemed permanent, eternal. Now watch as one by one those colors fade, as borders dissolve, as ancient lineages end, as the map transforms from a patchwork of rivals into a single unified expanse. This transformation took 10 years, a decade of campaigns, of armies marching, of cities falling, of kings surrendering or dying. 10 years that changed China forever. Let us walk through those years, kingdom by kingdom, conquest by conquest. Let the weight of each fallen realm settle gently in your mind. Han, the first to fall, 230 BCE. Han was the smallest of the 7 kingdoms, wedged uncomfortably between more powerful neighbors. It had survived thus far through diplomacy and luck, through playing rivals against each other, through being useful enough to preserve, but not threatening enough to prioritize for destruction. But its position made it strategically important to Qin. Han controlled key mountain passes and routes into the central plains. As long as Han remained independent, it was an obstacle, a barrier that complicated Qin's access to the kingdoms beyond. In 230 before the Common Era, Zheng decided the time had come. The campaign against Han was almost anticlimactic in its efficiency. Qin's armies, under competent, if not famous generals, advanced into Han territory with overwhelming force. Han's king, desperate and abandoned by potential allies who saw no benefit in defending a doomed kingdom, searched frantically for options. He sent envoys to Qin offering vassalage, tribute, anything to preserve some autonomy. But Zheng was not interested in vassals. He wanted complete annexation, total absorption. Half measures would only create future problems. The conquest was swift. Han's armies, outnumbered and outmatched, collapsed. Cities opened their gates rather than endure siege. Within a single campaigning season, the kingdom of Han ceased to exist. Its king was captured and likely executed, though some sources suggest he was allowed to live in comfortable captivity. Its territory was divided into Qin commanderies, administrative units governed by officials appointed from the capital. Its noble families were either absorbed into Qin's aristocracy or quietly eliminated. Han fell almost silently, without the dramatic last stands or tragic heroes that would characterize later conquests. It simply ended, like a candle flame pinched out between fingers. 1 kingdom down, 5 to go.
Zhao, the land of his birth, 228 BCE. Zhao was different. This was personal. Remember that Ying had been born in Zhao's capital, Handan. He had spent his childhood there as a hostage, hiding from those who would harm him, vulnerable and afraid. The people of Zhao had not been kind to the foreign prince in their midst. Now he returned, but not as a frightened child, as a conqueror. The campaign against Zhao was brutal. This was a kingdom of warriors, horsemen who had fought against northern barbarians and grown hard in those conflicts. They would not surrender easily. Qin's armies advanced methodically, using the strategies refined over decades. They avoided frontal assaults where possible, instead maneuvering to cut supply lines, isolate cities, force battles on favorable terrain. But Zhao had a brilliant general named Li Mu, one of the finest military minds of the age. Li Mu had defended Zhao's northern borders for years against raids from the steppes. He understood mobile warfare, understood how to use cavalry effectively, understood the importance of timing and position. Under Li Mu's command, Zhao's armies fought Qin to a standstill. Battles were won and lost on both sides. For a time, it seemed that Zhao might actually resist the Qin juggernaut. But Qin had weapons beyond its armies: gold and whispers. Qin's agents spread rumors in Zhao's court. They suggested that Li Mu was too powerful, that he might be planning to seize the throne for himself. They bribed officials to corroborate these lies. They created a web of suspicion around the very man who was defending Zhao most effectively. The king of Zhao, surrounded by corrupt advisors and fearful of betrayal, made a catastrophic decision. He relieved Li Mu of command, and when Li Mu refused to surrender his authority, knowing it would doom Zhao, the king had him executed. Zhao had just killed its own best defender based on enemy lies. With Li Mu gone, Zhao's resistance crumbled. Qin's armies advanced with renewed vigor. City after city fell. The capital, Handan, was besieged. Inside those walls, people huddled and waited. Perhaps some of them remembered the young hostage prince who had lived among them years before. Perhaps they wondered if he remembered them. When Handan fell, Ying's revenge was terrible. He ordered the execution of all those who had mistreated him during his childhood. Old scores, decades old, were settled in blood. The city that had been his prison became a monument to his vengeance. Zhao's king was captured. His fate is not entirely clear from the records, but he disappears from history. Execution seems most likely. The kingdom where Ying had been born, where he had known fear and powerlessness, was erased. Its territory became part of Qin. Its people became Qin's subjects. Did this bring him satisfaction, relief, or did the ruins of Handan whisper uncomfortable reminders of his own vulnerability, his own past weakness? History does not record his private feelings. It records only the outcome. Zhao was gone. 2 kingdoms down, 4 to go.
Wei, the Drowning, 225 BCE. Wei occupied the central plains, rich agricultural land crisscrossed by rivers. It had once been powerful, but decades of war had weakened it. Caught between stronger neighbors, squeezed by shifting alliances, Wei had declined. Still, its capital, Dalian, was formidable. The city's walls were high and thick, its granaries were full. A conventional siege could take years. But Qin's generals were not conventional thinkers. They observed that Dalian sat near the Yellow River, and they conceived a terrible plan. Qin's armies did not assault the walls. Instead, they built dams. They diverted the river's flow. They channeled water toward the city, slowly, methodically, turning the land around Dalian into a vast lake. Imagine being inside those walls,
watching the water rise. Day by day, the fields outside becoming swamps, then pools, then a spreading sea. Watching escape routes disappear beneath muddy water. Watching the river become a weapon more devastating than any army. The siege lasted 3 months. 3 months of rising water, of dwindling hope, of hunger and disease spreading through the trapped population. When the walls finally collapsed, undermined by water, when the flood poured through the breaches, thousands drowned. The city that had stood for centuries was washed away like sand before a tide. Wei's king surrendered amid the ruins. His kingdom was annexed, its territories absorbed. The people of Wei, those who survived the flood, became subjects of Qin. The drowning of Daliang became a legend, a cautionary tale about the futility of resisting Qin. It demonstrated that Ying Zheng's forces would use any method, exploit any advantage, accept any cost to achieve victory. 3 kingdoms down, 3 to go. Chu, the giant falls. 223 BCE. Chu was vast. It sprawled across the south, encompassing territory larger than some of the other kingdoms combined. It was wealthy from its rice paddies and river trade. It had a distinct culture, preserving traditions and religious practices that the northern kingdoms had abandoned. Chu was also confident, perhaps overconfident. Its sheer size seemed to guarantee survival. How could even Qin's formidable armies conquer such an expanse? The king of Qin asked his generals for their assessment. How many troops would be needed to conquer Chu? A younger general named Li Xin, eager and ambitious, suggested 200,000 men would suffice. He had achieved victories before and believed speed and audacity could overwhelm Chu's defenses. But Wang Jian, the methodical veteran, disagreed. He said it would require 600,000 soldiers, more than half of Qin's entire military strength, an enormous commitment. Ying Zheng, perhaps influenced by Li Xin's confidence or eager to preserve resources, chose to believe the optimistic assessment. He gave Li Xin command of 200,000 troops and sent him to conquer Chu. It was a disaster. Chu's armies, defending their homeland, fought with desperate courage. They knew what was at stake, everything. Li Xin advanced too quickly, overextended his supply lines, found himself surrounded. His forces were routed, scattered. He barely escaped with his life. Qin had suffered a humiliating defeat. Ying Zheng swallowed his pride and went to Wang Jian. The old general had retired, perhaps offended at being overruled. The king personally visited him, apologized for not taking his advice, and begged him to take command. Wang Jian agreed, but on his terms. He would have 600,000 soldiers, as he had originally requested. He would conduct the campaign at his own pace, using his own methods. The king would not interfere. Ying Zheng accepted these conditions. He gave Wang Jian the army he demanded, an unprecedented concentration of military power. Wang Jian marched south deliberately, carefully. He established fortified camps. He ensured supply lines were secure. He drilled his troops constantly, keeping them sharp but not wasting them in premature battles. Chu's armies harassed his forces, tried to draw him into unfavorable engagements. Wang Jian refused to be provoked. He waited. Months passed. Chu's generals grew frustrated. Their troops, kept in the field, began to suffer from the long deployment. Morale declined. Some units were withdrawn to rest. That's when Wang Jian struck. His armies advanced suddenly, catching Chu's forces partially dispersed and unprepared. The battle was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of men clashing across miles of battlefield. The earth trembled, the sky darkened with arrows. Chu's resistance, fierce as it was, could not withstand the disciplined onslaught. Their lines broke, their armies scattered. The conquest of Chu took time even after this decisive battle. The kingdom was simply too large to pacify quickly, but its spirit was broken. Resistance became localized, uncoordinated. City after city submitted. Chu's king fled, was captured, and died. The sources disagree on whether by execution or suicide. The great southern kingdom, proud and ancient, became territories of Qin. Its distinctive culture would persist in subtle ways, but its political independence was extinguished. 4 kingdoms down, 2 to go.
Yan, the failed assassination, 222 BCE. Yan, in the far northeast, watched the fall of the other kingdoms with growing terror. They knew their turn was coming. They knew they could not resist Qin militarily. So they tried something different. They hired an assassin. His name was Jing Ke, and he became legendary, though not for success. The plan was audacious. Jing Ke would approach Zheng under the guise of bringing tribute. He would carry maps supposedly showing Yan territory that the kingdom wished to cede to Qin. Hidden within the rolled maps would be a poisoned dagger. When he was close enough, in the presence of the king, he would strike. The attempt almost succeeded. In the throne room, Jing Ke unrolled the maps. As the scroll's end appeared, revealing the concealed dagger, he grabbed it and lunged at the king. What followed was chaos. Guards were stationed outside the throne room, not within. It was considered improper to bear arms in the king's immediate presence. Zheng, wearing ceremonial robes, had no weapon. He ran, dodging around pillars as Jing Ke pursued. For moments that must have felt like eternity, the king of Qin fled from a single assassin while his court watched in horror. Someone finally shouted for him to draw his sword, his ceremonial blade. In his panic, the king had forgotten he was armed. He drew the sword, turned, and wounded Jing Ke. Guards rushed in and killed the assassin. The king was safe, though badly shaken. But the attempt had consequences. Zheng's fury at Yan was absolute. The kingdom that had sent an assassin to murder him would pay dearly. Qin's armies invaded Yan with vengeance in their hearts. The conquest was swift and brutal. Yan's capital fell. Its king fled to the far northeast, seeking refuge among the semi-civilized tribes beyond China's borders. But there was no refuge from Qin's reach. Armies pursued. The king of Yan was hunted down and killed. His kingdom was absorbed entirely. Yan disappeared from the map, punished for daring to strike at the king who could not be stopped by conventional means. 5 kingdoms down, 1 to go. And then there was Qi, the last kingdom standing, the final obstacle between Zheng and the complete unification of China. Qi occupied the eastern coast, rich from maritime trade and agriculture. It had been a center of learning, its academies famous throughout China. It had watched the other kingdoms fall, one by one, and it somehow convinced itself that it might be spared. Perhaps Qi's rulers believed they could negotiate a special status, could preserve autonomy under Qin's nominal overlordship. Perhaps they thought their diplomatic skills could accomplish what military resistance had failed to achieve. They were deceived, both by their own hopes and by Qin's deliberate strategy. Qin had maintained friendly relations with Qi for years, even as it conquered Qi's neighbors. Envoys exchanged gifts and assurances. Qi was lulled into a false sense of security. When the other 5 kingdoms were gone, when only Qi remained, the pretense ended. Qin's armies advanced from multiple directions. Qi, which had not seriously prepared for war, which had allowed its military to decline, was helpless. The conquest was almost bloodless. Cities surrendered without fighting. The king of Qi, realizing resistance was futile, abdicated.
Some sources suggest he was treated relatively well, given lands and allowed to live out his life in comfortable retirement. Whether this is true or propaganda designed to encourage future surrenders, we cannot know. What matters is the result. In 221 before the Common Era, the last independent kingdom of China submitted to Qin. The Warring States period was over. After 2.5 centuries of conflict, China was unified under a single ruler. 6 kingdoms, each with its own character, each with its own story of resistance and fall. Han, small and quickly extinguished. Zhao, betrayed from within and conquered with vengeance. Wei, drowned by diverted rivers. Chu, the giant, brought low by patient strategy. Yan, destroyed for daring assassination. Qi, the last to fall, surrendering almost without a fight. Behind each conquest lay years of planning, thousands of lives lost, cities destroyed, families scattered. The human cost was enormous, though the ancient sources rarely recorded in detail. They tell us of battles won and kings defeated, but not of the farmers whose fields became battlegrounds, the merchants whose cities burned, the children who grew up knowing only war. But they also tell us this: the wars ended. For the first time in living memory, China was at peace. A harsh peace, perhaps, a peace imposed by force, but peace nonetheless. And standing above it all, surveying the unified realm he had created, was Ying Zheng. He had begun as a hostage prince, had become a king, had conquered an empire. But he was not yet an emperor. That transformation still lay ahead. First, he would have to decide what to do with this unprecedented achievement. How do you govern a unified China? What title do you claim when you have accomplished something no one has before? The answers to these questions would define not just his reign, but the future of China for millennia to come.
In the year 221 before the Common Era, in the capital of Qin, Ying Zheng sat in a chamber surrounded by his closest advisors. Outside, the empire he had created stretched in every direction, from the northern steppes to the southern jungles, from the western mountains to the eastern sea. China was unified, one realm, one law, one ruler. But what should that ruler be called? The traditional title was Wang, king. It was an ancient word, heavy with centuries of meaning. The kings of the Zhou dynasty had used it. The rulers of the 7 kingdoms had all been kings. It was a respectable title, dignified and proper. But it was also insufficient. Ying Zheng had not merely become another king. He had accomplished something unprecedented. He had not inherited a kingdom through bloodline or seized power through a palace coup. He had unified all of China, conquered territories spanning thousands of miles, brought an end to centuries of warfare. To call himself simply a king, just another Wang, would diminish the achievement. It would suggest continuity with the past, when what he had created was fundamentally new. His advisors debated the question. Some suggested ancient titles from China's legendary past. Others proposed combinations of existing words. The discussions went on for days, perhaps weeks, and then someone, sources suggest it was Li Si, though we cannot be certain, proposed something different. Why not combine 2 of the most ancient and sacred titles? The legendary rulers of China's distant past had been called the 3 sovereigns and the 5 emperors. The sovereigns were Huang, the emperors were Di. What if the king took both titles? What if he became Huang Di, emperor? But not just emperor, the first emperor, Shi Huang Di, because he was creating this position, defining it, bringing into existence something that had never been before. Ying Zheng approved this title, and in doing so, he transformed himself from king to emperor, from the ruler of Qin to the ruler of all China, from a man into a symbol. He became Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin. The title carried weight beyond its syllables.
It suggested that he stood above all previous rulers, that his achievement exceeded theirs. It claimed a connection to the legendary sage kings of antiquity, while simultaneously asserting something new. And it implied continuation, first emperor. The title suggested there would be a second, a third, a 100th. The dynasty he had founded would last 10,000 generations, or so he hoped. His descendants would rule as the second emperor, the third emperor, on and on into a future that seemed limitless. He even reformed the way succession would work. Previously, rulers had personal names and were often remembered by posthumous titles reflecting their character or achievements. But Qin Shi Huang decreed that his successors would simply be numbered. He was the first, his son would be the second, and so forth. It was meant to create a sense of eternal continuity, of a dynasty that would never end. The irony, bitter and complete, was that the Qin dynasty would last only until the third emperor. The grand vision of 10,000 generations would collapse within 15 years of the first emperor's death.
But in 221 before the Common Era, that failure lay hidden in an unknowable future. In that moment, everything seemed possible. The coronation as first emperor was accompanied by elaborate ceremonies. These were not mere spectacles, though they were certainly spectacular. They were rituals designed to connect the new emperor to heaven, to legitimize his rule through cosmic alignment. Ancient Chinese political philosophy taught that rulers governed through the mandate of heaven, Tian Ming. Heaven, conceived not as a personal god, but as a cosmic force, granted authority to virtuous rulers. When a ruler lost virtue, heaven withdrew its mandate, and the dynasty would fall. Qin Shi Huang needed to demonstrate that he possessed this mandate, that his conquest was not mere military success, but a fulfillment of cosmic order. So rituals were performed. Sacrifices were offered at sacred mountains. Divinations were conducted. Auguries were interpreted to show that heaven approved of the new dynasty. The emperor traveled to Mount Tai, the most sacred mountain in China. There he performed the Feng and Shan sacrifices, ancient ceremonies that had not been conducted in centuries. These rituals involved offerings to heaven and earth, acknowledgement of the cosmic forces that governed all existence. By performing these ceremonies, Qin Shi Huang was claiming a place among the legendary sage kings of the past. He was saying, in effect, that his rule was ordained by the same cosmic order that had legitimized the ancient rulers whose stories had become mythology. The symbolism extended to every aspect of governance. The emperor adopted specific colors, numbers, and elements that were associated with his dynasty according to the theories of the time. Ancient Chinese philosophy taught that history moved in cycles governed by 5 elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. Each dynasty was associated with one element, and dynasties succeeded each other in a specific order. The Zhou dynasty, which had preceded the Warring States period, was associated with fire and the color red. According to the theory, fire would be succeeded by water. Water's color was black. Its corresponding number was 6. Therefore, Qin adopted black as its official color. The emperor's robes were black. Banners were black. 6 became a significant number in administration. Measures were divided into groups of 6. Official hats were 6 inches tall. Carriages were pulled by teams of 6 horses. To modern minds, this might seem like mere superstition, but in the context of ancient Chinese thought, it was a way of aligning human society with cosmic patterns, of demonstrating that the dynasty was in harmony with the fundamental forces of nature. The emperor's vision for his unified realm was ambitious. He did not want to simply rule over the conquered kingdoms as separate entities. He wanted to transform them into a single integrated empire.
This meant breaking down the old identities, the old loyalties. People would no longer think of themselves as Han or Zhao or Chu. They would be subjects of the empire, citizens of a unified realm. To accomplish this, he would need to standardize everything: language, currency, measurements, laws. All the mechanisms of daily life needed to be unified so that a merchant in the far south used the same measures as a farmer in the north, so that legal codes were consistent across the empire. This project of standardization would become one of the defining characteristics of his reign. We will explore it in detail in the next chapter, but the vision, the philosophy, was established here in these early days of the empire. The emperor saw himself as a transformative figure, someone who could reshape society through sheer will and systematic application of power. The legalist philosophy that had guided Qin to victory would now guide the governance of all China. There would be one law applied equally to all, no special privileges for nobility, no exemptions based on ancient custom. The law would be supreme, and the emperor was the source of law.
This was revolutionary. In the old kingdoms, society had been organized through complex webs of obligation and relationship. Nobles had traditional rights, cities had customary privileges, laws varied by region and social class. Qin Shi Huang swept all of this away. In the new empire, only the emperor's decrees mattered. Only the centralized state had authority. It was an attempt to create what we might call a modern bureaucratic state, centuries before such concepts became common. Officials would be appointed based on competence, not birth. They would be rotated regularly to prevent them from building local power bases. They would be monitored, evaluated, promoted, or demoted based on their effectiveness. The empire was divided into commanderies and counties, administrative units governed by appointed officials. The old nobility was not entirely eliminated, but their power was broken. Many noble families were forced to relocate to the capital, where they could be watched and kept away from their traditional power bases. This centralization of power was unprecedented in its scope and thoroughness, and it required an enormous bureaucracy to implement. Thousands of officials were needed to govern the vast empire. They needed to be trained, supervised, coordinated. Records needed to be kept, reports filed, communications maintained across vast distances. The emperor himself worked tirelessly. Ancient sources record that he would process enormous quantities of documents daily, reading reports, issuing edicts, making decisions. He apparently weighed the documents, 120 pounds of bamboo and wooden slips each day covered with administrative text. Whether this specific detail is accurate or exaggerated, it conveys the essential truth. Governing a unified China required constant attention and immense labor. But the emperor did not shy from this labor. He had spent a decade conquering China. Now he would spend the rest of his life trying to transform it, to create something that would last beyond him, to build a legacy that would echo through the ages. Standing in his palace, wearing his black robes, surrounded by officials in a capital that had become the center of the known world, Qin Shi Huang must have felt that anything was possible. He had unified China. He had created a new title and claimed cosmic legitimacy. He had begun the great project of transformation that would standardize and centralize everything. What else might he accomplish? The answer, as we will see, was astonishing in both its ambition and its contradictions. He would build structures that still stand today, monuments that have outlasted his dynasty by millennia. He would also commit acts of cultural destruction that would be remembered with horror for generations. He would seek to conquer death itself, to extend his rule not just across space, but across time, to become truly immortal. And in that quest, he would reveal both the heights of human ambition and the depths of its futility. But for now, in 221 before the Common Era, the first emperor surveyed his empire and began the work of remaking the world. The vision was clear, the will was absolute, the power was unprecedented. Now came the implementation, and that would prove to be a project as ambitious as the conquests themselves. Imagine trying to conduct business across the newly unified empire. You are a merchant in what was once Chu, traveling to what was once Zhao. You carry goods to trade, coins to spend, documents recording your transactions. But the coins from Chu are not accepted in Zhao. The weights you use to measure your goods are different from the weights used in northern markets. The contracts you carry are written in a script that northern officials struggle to read. The wheels of your cart, perfectly sized for Chu's roads, fit awkwardly in the ruts worn by northern vehicles. Every border you crossed, even though they were now internal borders of a single empire, presented barriers. Different standards, different systems, different ways of doing everything. This was the reality that confronted Qin Shi Huang in the wake of unification. He had conquered the kingdoms, but China was still fragmented in 1,000 subtle ways. The old divisions persisted in measurements and money, in written characters and wheel widths. True unity required more than military victory. It required standardization. And so the emperor embarked on a project of unification that was, in its own way, as ambitious as the conquests themselves. He would impose order on chaos, create uniformity from diversity, force the fragments to become one whole. This was legalist philosophy in action, the belief that society functioned best when everything was regulated, standardized, made predictable, and controllable. Variety created confusion. Confusion created inefficiency. Efficiency required uniformity. Let us explore how this philosophy manifested in practical reforms, each one reshaping daily life across the empire. The unification of writing. Language was perhaps the most fundamental barrier. While the various kingdoms all spoke languages that were related and shared many words, they had developed different scripts over the centuries. The characters used to write in Chu looked different from those used in Qi. Even when representing the same word, the same concept, the characters had evolved differently in different regions. Some were more elaborate, with extra strokes and flourishes. Others were simplified. Some kingdoms had developed entirely unique characters for concepts others expressed differently. For a government trying to administer a vast empire, this diversity was intolerable. How could you issue edicts that would be understood uniformly across all territories? How could officials in distant provinces communicate clearly with the capital? The solution was to standardize the script, to create one official form of Chinese written that would be used throughout the empire. The script that was chosen as the standard was called Small Seal Script, Xiao Zhuan. It was based on the script that had been used in Chu, refined and formalized under the guidance of Li Si and other scholars. Every character was regulated. The number of strokes, their order, their precise form, all of this was codified. Officials and scribes had to learn this standardized script. Documents were to be written only in this approved form. This was an enormous undertaking. Imagine being a scribe in what was once Chu, trained in the traditional characters of your region, now required to relearn writing according to new standards. Imagine the libraries and archives full of texts written in the old scripts, now technically obsolete. But the reform was enforced with typical Qin thoroughness. Schools taught the new script. Officials who couldn't write correctly were dismissed or retrained. Over time, the small seal script became the norm across the empire. This standardization had profound effects. It made administration more efficient as the emperor intended. But it did something else, something perhaps more lasting. It created a written language that could be understood across regions, even when spoken dialects differed. A person from the south and a person from the north might speak languages so different they couldn't understand each other's speech. But if they both learned the standardized script, they could communicate in writing.
The characters transcended the spoken word. This principle, that written Chinese could unite people who spoke different languages, would become fundamental to Chinese civilization. It's one reason why China, despite its vast size and regional diversity, maintained cultural unity across millennia. And it began with Qin Shi Huang's decree that all writing must conform to one standard.
Weights and measures. Trade and taxation required accurate measurement. How much grain was in a bushel? How heavy was a cartload of iron? How long was a bolt of silk? In the Old Kingdoms, every region had its own answers to these questions. A bushel in Jiao held a different volume than a bushel in Wei. A pound of weight in Yan was not the same as a pound in Chu. This made trade complicated and taxation nearly impossible to standardize. A farmer in one region might pay more or less tax than a farmer with an identical harvest in another region, simply because their bushels were different sizes. The emperor decreed uniformity. Standard weights were created, bronze objects precisely calibrated. Standard measures of volume and length were defined. These standards were then distributed throughout the empire. Officials were provided with certified weights and measures, often inscribed with imperial decrees confirming their accuracy. Markets were required to use these standard tools. Anyone caught using false or unapproved measures faced severe punishment. Archaeological finds have uncovered some of these standardized weights, bronze pieces inscribed with edicts from Qin Shi Huang. They are beautiful objects in their way, functional yet carefully crafted, each one a small monument to the emperor's obsession with order. The standardization of weights and measures might seem like a dry administrative reform, but consider its impact on ordinary life. A merchant could now travel from one end of the empire to the other, confident that his measurements would be recognized and accepted. A farmer knew exactly what his tax burden would be. Trade became more efficient, taxation more equitable. It was a practical reform that made the empire function more smoothly. And, like many of the emperor's reforms, it outlasted his dynasty, becoming a permanent feature of Chinese governance. Currency. Money was similarly chaotic. Each kingdom had minted its own coins, in different shapes, different weights, different materials. Some used bronze coins shaped like knives or spades. Others used round coins with square holes. The value of coins varied by region, and exchange rates were inconsistent. The first emperor abolished this diversity. He decreed that the empire would use a single currency, round bronze coins with a square hole in the center. The shape was symbolic. The round coin represented heaven, the square hole represented earth, and the coin thus embodied the harmony of cosmic forces. These coins were stamped with official marks confirming their weight and purity. They were minted in government-controlled facilities to prevent counterfeiting and ensure consistency. The standardized currency transformed economic life. Trade became simpler. Merchants no longer needed to constantly calculate exchange rates between regional currencies. The government could more easily collect taxes and pay officials. Economic integration followed political unification. The round coin with a square hole would remain the standard Chinese currency design for more than 2,000 years, used by dynasty after dynasty, a direct legacy of Qin Shi Huang's reforms.
The width of cart axles. Perhaps the most seemingly trivial of the standardization reforms was also one of the most practical. The emperor decreed that all carts and wagons must have axles of the same width. Why would this matter? Consider the roads of ancient China. Most were not paved. Cart wheels passing over the same routes repeatedly would wear ruts into the dirt and mud. If all carts had axles of the same width, their wheels would run in the same ruts, deepening them into consistent grooves. Once roads had these established ruts, carts with standardized axles could travel more easily. The wheels would naturally follow the grooves.
It made transportation smoother, required less effort from the draft animals, reduced wear on the carts themselves. But if a cart had axles of a different width, its wheels wouldn't align with the ruts. It would ride awkwardly, one wheel in a rut and one out, or constantly bouncing between ruts. Travel would be slower and more difficult. By standardizing axle width, the emperor was effectively creating a primitive system of infrastructure that worked in harmony with the vehicles using it. The roads and the carts became parts of an integrated system. This reform also had military applications. Standard axle widths meant that military supply wagons could travel efficiently on the same roads everywhere in the empire. Armies could move more quickly, logistics became more reliable. It was typical of the emperor's approach, taking a small detail, something that might seem insignificant, and recognizing its larger systemic importance, then using state power to impose a standard that made the entire system more efficient. The philosophy of uniformity. Behind all these reforms lay a consistent philosophy. Diversity was inefficiency. Variety was disorder. Uniformity was strength. This was legalism taken to its logical conclusion. If laws should be uniform and universally applied, why not extend that principle to everything? Why not create a society where everything was standardized, regulated, predictable? From a certain perspective, this made perfect sense. Standardization did make the empire more efficient. It did facilitate trade, improve administration, enable more effective governance. But it also represented something more troubling, an impulse toward total control, toward eliminating anything that couldn't be regulated and standardized, a belief that the state had the right, even the duty, to regulate every aspect of life. This philosophy would lead to some of the emperor's most controversial actions. If writing should be standardized, what about ideas? If everyone should use the same measurements and currency, shouldn't they also think the same thoughts, value the same things? The burning of books and burial of scholars, which we will explore in a later chapter, grew from this same impulse toward uniformity. Different philosophies, different interpretations of history, different ideas about how society should be organized, these were diversity, and diversity was disorder. The emperor's standardization reforms were, in many ways, beneficial. They made China function as a unified state. They established systems that would last for millennia. They demonstrated that practical benefits could come from centralized planning and systematic implementation. But they also revealed the danger of taking these principles too far. The same mindset that efficiently standardized currency could also justify suppressing independent thought. The same belief in uniformity that created practical benefits could also crush regional cultures and local traditions. Qin Shi Huang, standing in his palace, reviewing reports of the standardization's progress, likely saw only the benefits. The empire was becoming more integrated, more efficient, more unified. His vision was being realized. But the costs of that vision, the losses that came with imposed uniformity, were harder to see. They would become apparent only over time, as regional traditions faded, as local variations were suppressed, as the rich diversity of Chinese culture was compressed into approved forms. The question that haunts the emperor's legacy is whether the benefits outweighed the costs, whether the efficiency gained justified the diversity lost, whether true unity required such thoroughgoing uniformity, or whether a more flexible approach might have achieved similar benefits with fewer drawbacks. History offers no simple answers. The standardization reforms worked. The empire functioned more smoothly because of them. Many of these standards persisted for centuries, even millennia. But something was lost too, something harder to measure or quantify. The sense that different regions could maintain their own character while still being part of a larger whole. The idea that unity didn't require uniformity, that diversity could coexist with integration. These tensions between order and freedom, efficiency and diversity, central control and local autonomy are not unique to ancient China.
They resurface in every society in every age. Qin Shi Huang's standardization reforms simply posed these questions in particularly stark form. For now, the reforms proceeded. Weights and measures, currency and script, even the width of cartwheels, all were standardized according to imperial decree. The empire was being reforged into something new, something more unified than China had ever been. And the emperor, tireless and relentless, moved on to his next great project. If he could standardize currency and writing, why couldn't he standardize the borders themselves? Why couldn't he build a barrier that would permanently separate civilization from barbarism, the empire from its enemies? The Great Wall was calling, and it would demand a price in labor and lives that would dwarf everything that had come before.
Look north from the heart of China, toward the vast steppes that stretch beyond the horizon. There, where the cultivated fields give way to grasslands, where settled farmers meet nomadic herders, an ancient boundary has always existed. Not a line on a map, but a division of ways of life, of civilizations fundamentally different. The people of the steppes, the Xiongnu and other nomadic tribes, lived by different rules than the agricultural Chinese. They were horsemen, herders, warriors who could strike swiftly and vanish into the endless grasslands. They raided Chinese settlements, taking livestock and grain, then disappearing before armies could respond. For centuries, the northern kingdoms had built walls to defend against these raids. Not one great wall, but many walls, sections of fortification that marked boundaries, protected passes, created barriers where geography alone was insufficient. When Qin Shi Huang unified China, these old walls remained, scattered across the landscape like broken teeth. Some were in Qin's former territory, others in the conquered kingdoms. They were built of different materials, rammed earth, stone, and wood, and served different purposes, protected different frontiers. The emperor looked at these fragments and saw something that had never existed, a continuous barrier, a wall that would stretch across the entire northern frontier, connecting the mountains in the west to the sea in the east, a permanent boundary between civilization and barbarism, between the empire and the chaos beyond. It would be the largest construction project the world had yet seen, and it would cost more lives than any of his military campaigns. The man chosen to oversee this monumental task was General Meng Tian, the same capable commander who had helped conquer the Six Kingdoms. In 215 before the Common Era, he was given an army of 300,000 men and sent north with instructions that must have seemed almost impossible. Build a wall across the world. Meng Tian was a practical man, a soldier who understood logistics and organization. He looked at the emperor's vision and broke it down into achievable tasks. First, drive the Xiongnu away from the border regions, creating a buffer zone where construction could proceed safely. Second, assess the existing walls, determine which could be incorporated and which needed to be replaced. Third, organize the labor force, the supply lines, the systematic construction that would create something unprecedented. The campaign against the Xiongnu was swift. Meng Tian's armies drove them back from the frontier, reclaiming territory and establishing a defensive perimeter. Then the real work began. 300,000 soldiers became 300,000 laborers. They were joined by hundreds of thousands more, conscripted peasants, convicted criminals, anyone the state could mobilize. Some sources suggest that at the height of construction, nearly 1 million workers toiled on the wall. Imagine that scale of human effort. 1 million people, scattered across hundreds of miles of frontier, all working towards a single purpose. The logistics alone were staggering. Materials had to be transported to remote regions. In some areas, stone was available and could be quarried locally. In others, particularly on the plains, workers used rammed earth, layers of soil pounded between wooden frames until they formed walls as hard as stone. The construction technique for rammed earth walls was ancient but effective. Workers would build wooden frames defining the wall's dimensions.
Then they would pour in soil, gravel, and sometimes lime, layer by layer, each layer tamped down with heavy poles until it compressed into a solid mass. When the frames were removed, a wall remained, surprisingly durable despite being made essentially of dirt. In mountainous regions, the wall followed ridgelines, using the natural terrain for additional defense. Workers carved footholds in steep slopes, hauled stones up impossible grades, built towers on peaks that seemed unreachable. The conditions were brutal. Summer brought scorching heat on the plains and in the valleys. Winter brought winds that swept down from the steppes, so cold that workers' fingers would freeze as they tried to work. The remote locations meant that supply lines were long and vulnerable. Food was often scarce, medical care was non-existent, and the work was dangerous. Falls from scaffolding killed workers regularly. Cave-ins during quarrying buried people alive. The simple exhaustion of hauling stones and tamping earth day after day, week after week, broke bodies and spirits.
How many died building the wall? The ancient sources offer no precise numbers, and modern historians can only estimate. Tens of thousands, certainly, perhaps hundreds of thousands. The wall became, in a very literal sense, a monument built of human bones. Legends grew around this suffering. Folk tales whispered among the workers, stories that tried to make sense of the immense human cost. The most famous of these stories is the tale of Meng Jiangnü, though it may have originated later and been retroactively attached to the Great Wall's construction. The story goes that a young woman named Meng Jiangnü was newly married when her husband was conscripted to work on the wall. Months passed with no word from him. Winter came, and Meng Jiangnü, fearing he would freeze in the northern cold, wove warm clothes and set out to bring them to him. She traveled for months, enduring hardships and dangers, driven by love and devotion. When she finally reached the wall, she asked about her husband. The workers looked away. Eventually, someone told her the truth. He had died during construction. He was buried somewhere in or near the wall, but no one knew exactly where. Meng Jiangnü's grief was inconsolable. She wept at the base of the wall, and her tears were so powerful, so filled with sorrow, that a section of the wall collapsed, revealing the bones of the workers buried within. Among them, she found her husband's remains. The story ends differently in different versions. In some, she throws herself into the sea, joining her husband in death. In others, the emperor himself hears of her devotion and is moved, but she rejects his attention, choosing death over life without her beloved. The tale of Meng Jiangnü became one of the most enduring legends in Chinese culture. It represented something the official histories could not: the human cost of the emperor's ambitions, the suffering of ordinary people caught in the machinery of grand projects. Whether any particular woman named Meng Jiangnü actually existed is uncertain, but the truth the story expresses is undeniable. The wall was built with human suffering, and that suffering deserves to be remembered alongside the engineering triumph. Workers who survived the construction carried the memories with them for the rest of their lives. They had seen friends die. They had endured conditions that pushed human endurance to its limits. They had built something that would outlast them by millennia, but at a cost they never chose to pay. For many, conscription to the wall was effectively a death sentence. Families would mourn when their sons or husbands were taken, knowing they might never return. Communities lost their strongest workers, leaving fields untended and local economies disrupted. The resentment this created was profound. It festered beneath the surface of imperial order, a silent accusation against the emperor who demanded such sacrifice. Yet the wall rose, mile by mile, section by section, tower by tower. It connected old walls and filled gaps. It traversed deserts and mountains, plains and river valleys. It became the physical manifestation of the emperor's will, a line drawn across the landscape saying, here civilization ends, here the empire's protection begins and ends. What was the strategic value of this enormous investment in labor and lives? The wall was never meant to be an impenetrable barrier. Any wall, no matter how high or thick, can eventually be breached or circumvented with sufficient determination. The nomadic raiders knew the terrain, knew where the wall was weakest, where guards might be sparse.
But the wall changed the calculus of raiding. Before, small groups could strike quickly at border settlements and vanish back into the steppes. Now they had to cross a barrier, even if only a temporary one. They had to pass watchtowers where guards could spot them and light signal fires. Those signal fires were crucial. They could transmit warnings hundreds of miles in the matter of hours, much faster than any horse could travel. A raid spotted at one section of the wall would be reported to military stations along the frontier, allowing armies to respond. The wall also served as a road. Its top was wide enough for troops to move rapidly along it, allowing defenders to concentrate forces at threatened points. Supply depots and garrison towns were positioned along its length, creating a permanent military presence in the borderlands.
So the wall was less an absolute barrier and more a system, a combination of physical fortification, communication network, and military infrastructure that made the northern frontier defensible in ways it had never been before. But beyond the strategic considerations, the wall had symbolic importance. It was a statement of permanence. It said that the empire would last forever, that the boundary between China and the barbarian lands was fixed for all time. It embodied the emperor's belief that through sufficient application of will and resources, he could reshape reality itself. The wall was also a symbol of separation, of the fundamental divide between civilization and savagery as the Chinese understood it. Those inside the wall lived under law, practiced agriculture, participated in the cultural traditions that defined Chinese identity. Those outside were other, different, dangerous. This symbolism would outlast the Qin dynasty by millennia. The Great Wall, repaired and extended by later dynasties, would become one of the defining symbols of China itself. Visitors from distant lands would marvel at it. Poets would write about it. It would appear in paintings and stories, always representing the same essential idea, the boundary that must be maintained, the barrier that protects civilization. But in the years of its construction, during Qin Shi Huang's reign, the wall was also something else. It was a consumer of lives, a project that ground up human beings and left their bones scattered across the northern frontier. General Meng Tian oversaw this immense sacrifice with military efficiency. He rotated work crews, maintained discipline, ensured that construction proceeded according to plan. He was, by all accounts, competent and dedicated, but he also understood, perhaps better than the emperor who ordered the project, what it was costing. He saw the workers dying. He heard the complaints and the quiet desperation. He knew that every mile of wall represented countless lives disrupted or destroyed. Did he ever question the worth of the project? Did he ever wonder if the strategic benefits justified the human cost? If he did, he left no record of such doubts. He was a soldier, and soldiers follow orders. The wall's construction continued throughout the remainder of Qin Shi Huang's reign. It was never truly finished. Such a project could always be extended, improved, reinforced, but it reached a state where it functioned, where it served its purposes of defense and symbolism. And it stood, as it still stands today, though much of what we see now comes from later dynasties who rebuilt and extended the Qin's original construction. The Ming dynasty, nearly 2,000 years after Qin Shi Huang, would create the stone wall that tourists photograph today. But the foundation, the concept, the initial construction, that was Qin's. That was the first emperor's vision made manifest in earth and stone. Let the image of the wall settle in your mind. See it stretching across mountains and valleys, a ribbon of stone and earth running toward distant horizons. See the watchtowers, spaced at regular intervals, smoke rising from their signal fires. See the workers, tiny figures toiling under the vast sky, building something that would outlast them by ages. And see the cost, the graves unmarked and uncounted, the families torn apart, the suffering that official histories barely acknowledge, but that folk memory preserves in stories like that of Meng Jiangnu. The Great Wall was both triumph and tragedy, an engineering marvel and a monument to human sacrifice, a symbol of strength and a reminder of the price of imperial ambition.
Qin Shi Huang, looking north from his palace toward the wall that was rising at his command, likely saw only the triumph, the vision realized, the boundary established, the empire protected and defined. Whether he ever considered the cost, whether the reports of deaths and suffering troubled his sleep, we cannot know. The historical record preserves his orders and his achievements, but not his private thoughts. What we know is the wall rose, and China would never be the same.
An empire is more than borders and walls. It is a living system, a network of connections that allows resources to flow, armies to move, information to travel. Without these arteries of communication and transport, even the most unified realm would fragment into isolated regions, each drifting into its own orbit. Qin Shi Huang understood this. The Great Wall defined the empire's outer boundary, but the interior needed connections. Roads to bind distant provinces to the capital, canals to move goods where rivers did not naturally flow, infrastructure that would make the vast distances of China seem smaller, more manageable. And so, even as workers toiled on the wall, other massive construction projects were undertaken throughout the empire, projects that received less attention in the histories perhaps, but which were equally important to the functioning of the unified realm. The imperial highway system. Roads had existed in China for centuries, of course. Dirt paths connecting villages, trade routes worn smooth by generations of merchants, military roads built by the old kingdoms. But these were inconsistent, maintained locally if at all, varying in quality and direction. The emperor decreed something different, a network of imperial highways radiating from the capital like spokes from a wheel's hub. These would not be mere paths, but engineered roads, built to standards, maintained by the state. The main highway, called the Straight Road, ran north from the capital toward the wall, stretching for more than 500 miles. It was built wide enough for multiple carts to travel abreast, its surface carefully prepared and maintained. In some sections, the road was elevated above the surrounding terrain, protecting it from flooding and making it easier to defend. In others, it cut through hills, leveling the route to make travel faster and more predictable. Trees were planted along many sections, providing shade for travelers and clearly marking the road's path. Rest stations were established at regular intervals, offering food, water, and shelter for official couriers and military units. The construction of these roads required enormous labor. Workers had to clear terrain, level surfaces, build bridges across rivers and ravines. In mountainous areas, roads were carved into cliff faces, supported by wooden scaffolding that seemed to hang in empty air. But the benefits were substantial. Messages could travel from the capital to distant provinces in days rather than weeks. Armies could deploy rapidly to trouble spots. Merchants found trade easier and more profitable, encouraging commerce that further integrated the empire. The roads also served a political purpose. They made the provinces feel closer to the center of power. An official in a remote commandery knew that imperial representatives could arrive swiftly, that distance provided no protection from central authority. The emperor himself used these roads for inspection tours. He traveled extensively throughout his realm, visiting provinces, checking on local officials, making his presence felt in regions that might otherwise have felt abandoned or forgotten. These tours were elaborate affairs. The imperial procession would include hundreds or thousands of people, officials, guards, servants, advisors. Special rest palaces were built along the routes, miniature replicas of the capital's grandeur where the emperor could stay in comfort. The inspection tours served multiple purposes. They allowed the emperor to assess conditions firsthand rather than relying solely on reports. They demonstrated imperial power and authority to local populations. They also satisfied something in the emperor's character, a restless energy, a need to see and control everything personally. But roads alone could not solve all transportation challenges. Water transport was often more efficient for moving bulk goods, but rivers did not always flow where they were needed.
This is where canals became essential.
The Lingqiu Canal. In the far south, Qin's conquests had expanded the empire into regions very different from the northern heartland. The territory that had been the kingdom of Chu stretched into subtropical zones, lands of rice paddies and abundant rainfall. But supplying military forces in these southern regions was difficult. Rivers flowed generally east to west, while armies needed supplies moving north to south. Overland transport was possible, but inefficient for the quantities of grain and equipment required. The solution was a canal. Not just any canal, but an engineering marvel that would connect two major river systems, allowing boats to travel between watersheds that nature had separated. This was the Lingqiu Canal, and it remains one of the most impressive engineering achievements of ancient China. The canal connected the Xiang River, which flowed into the Yangtze system, with the Li River, which flowed into the Pearl River system. By linking these rivers, the canal created a water route from northern China deep into the south. But the technical challenge was formidable. The two rivers had different elevations, and the terrain between them was hilly. Water does not flow uphill, so how could boats traverse the elevation changes? The engineers devised an ingenious solution. They built a series of locks and gates that could control water levels, allowing boats to ascend and descend as needed. They also created a unique split-flow system at the canal's head, dividing the river's water to maintain both the canal and the original river channel. The construction required precise calculation and careful execution. Workers had to excavate through hills, line the canal bed to prevent erosion, build control structures that could withstand the force of moving water. When completed, the Lingqiu Canal was about 20 miles long, but those 20 miles connected vast regions that had previously been difficult to link. Supplies could now flow south efficiently. Trade goods from the subtropical south could reach northern markets more easily. The canal was so well designed that it continued to function for centuries. Indeed, modified and maintained versions of it still exist today, more than 2,000 years later, a testament to the engineering skill of Qin's builders.
Architectural monuments. Beyond roads and canals, the empire was dotted with architectural projects that served both practical and symbolic purposes. The capital itself was expanded and beautified. Palaces were built on a scale meant to awe visitors and demonstrate the dynasty's power. The main palace complex, called the Yipeng Palace, was said to be enormous, though sources disagree on its exact size and whether it was ever fully completed. Ancient descriptions paint a picture of almost unbelievable grandeur. Halls large enough to seat thousands, corridors connecting dozens of buildings, gardens with rare plants brought from across the empire, artificial lakes and waterways. Some modern scholars question whether these descriptions are accurate or exaggerated. Archaeological evidence suggests that while substantial construction did occur, it may not have reached the legendary proportions described in later texts. But whether the reality matched the legend or not, the intent was clear: to create architecture that would dwarf anything the old kingdoms had built, to manifest imperial power in wood and stone. Throughout the empire, standardized administrative buildings were constructed. Each commandery capital received a similar complex of official buildings, creating visual consistency that reinforced the message of unity. An official traveling from one province to another would find familiar structures, organized in familiar ways. This architectural standardization was another form of unification, less obvious than currency or script, but equally effective at creating a sense of imperial coherence. The living network. Together, these infrastructure projects, roads and canals, palaces and administrative buildings, created a functional network that made the empire more than a collection of conquered territories. They enabled commerce. A farmer in the south could sell rice to markets in the north. A craftsman in one region could obtain materials from another. Trade flourished, and with trade came cultural exchange, further eroding the old kingdom boundaries. They enabled administration.
Officials could travel to their posts, reports could reach the capital, orders could be disseminated. The bureaucracy that governed the empire depended on these communication and transportation networks. They enabled military power. Armies could deploy rapidly to suppress rebellions or defend against external threats. Supplies could reach troops in distant regions. The emperor's ability to project force throughout his realm rested on these roads and canals. But perhaps most importantly, they created psychological unity. When people traveled the same roads, crossed the same canals, saw similar architecture in different provinces, they developed a sense that these places were connected, that they were part of something larger than their local region. The infrastructure made the empire real in daily life. It transformed the abstract concept of unification into concrete experience. The human cost of these projects, like the wall, was substantial. Hundreds of thousands labored on road construction, canal excavation, building projects. Many died far from home, their bodies buried beside the roots they helped create. But unlike the wall, these projects faced less resistance and resentment. Roads and canals brought obvious benefits to ordinary people. They made travel easier, trade more profitable, communication more reliable. The sacrifices demanded seemed more justified when the benefits were so apparent. Qin Shi Huang, reviewing reports of construction progress, maps showing the growing network of roads and canals, must have felt satisfaction. His vision was taking shape. The empire was being knit together, connected, made into something cohesive and enduring. The infrastructure would outlast his dynasty. Later emperors would maintain the roads, extend the canals, build upon the foundations Qin had laid. The network would grow and evolve, but its origins lay in these years of furious construction under the first emperor's direction. Stand for a moment on one of those ancient roads, if only in imagination. Feel the stone beneath your feet, worn smooth by 2,000 years of travelers. Look along its length, stretching towards distant horizons. This road connected the empire then, and in a sense, it still does, linking the present to that distant past when one man's vision reshaped the landscape of China. The infrastructure of empire was more than engineering. It was a statement of intent, a commitment to permanence, a network of connections that would bind the future to the choices made in these transformative years. And those choices, for better or worse, would echo through centuries to come.
There are moments in history that cast long shadows, moments that transform a ruler's legacy from complex to condemned. For Qin Shi Huang, those moments came in the years 213 and 212 before the Common Era, when he turned his impulse toward control from the physical world to the realm of ideas. What happened in those years has been debated, analyzed, condemned, and occasionally defended for more than 2,000 years. The burning of books and the burial of scholars, these acts would become synonymous with tyranny, with the suppression of knowledge, with the fear of ideas that threatens every authoritarian regime. But to understand these acts, we must first understand the context that produced them. We must enter the mind of an emperor who believed he had created something unprecedented and who feared that the past might undermine his vision of the future. The Confucian challenge. The empire was unified. The kingdoms were conquered. The walls were rising. The roads were spreading. Everything was proceeding according to legalist principles: efficiency, standardization, centralized control. But there was resistance, subtle and persistent. Not military resistance, that had been crushed, but intellectual resistance, philosophical opposition to the very foundations of Qin's system. At the court, among the scholars and advisors who surrounded the emperor, there were men who looked back to the past with reverence. Confucian scholars, disciples of traditions that valued ritual over law, virtue over power, ancient wisdom over contemporary innovation. These scholars spoke of the sage kings of old, rulers who would govern through moral example rather than strict laws. They quoted the classics, ancient texts that preserved the wisdom of previous ages. They suggested, sometimes subtly and sometimes openly, that the emperor's methods were harsh, that his legalist system was contrary to proper governance. One evening at a court banquet in 213 before the Common Era, a scholar named Chun Yu Yue spoke up. He praised the emperor's achievements, but then suggested that the empire should be governed according to ancient models.
He pointed out that previous dynasties had granted lands to relatives and loyal followers, creating a feudal system rather than the centralized commandery system Qin had imposed. It was a criticism, carefully phrased but unmistakable. The scholar was saying that the emperor's system was flawed, that he should look to the past for guidance rather than imposing his own innovations. Li Si, the emperor's chancellor and chief advisor, was present. He had been the young king's tutor decades ago, had taught him legalist philosophy, had helped shape the policies that created the unified empire. He had no patience for Confucian nostalgia. Li Si responded with a memorial to the emperor, a document that would change history. He argued that the scholars were dangerous. By constantly praising the past, they were implicitly criticizing the present. By holding up ancient models as superior, they were undermining the emperor's authority. They confused the people, created doubt, fostered resistance to beneficial reforms. The old texts they revered, Li Si said, were the problem. People read about the ancient kingdoms and imagined alternatives to the current system. They studied the philosophies of different schools and developed ideas contrary to legalism. This intellectual diversity was a threat to unity. Li Si proposed a solution: radical, comprehensive, shocking. All books, except those on practical subjects, medicine, agriculture, divination, should be destroyed. The historical records of the old kingdoms should be burned. The classic texts that Confucians revered should be eliminated. Only books on technical subjects and the official histories of Qin should be preserved. Anyone who wished to study law and governance should learn only from Qin's appointed officials. The past would be erased, or at least made inaccessible. People would know only the present dynasty, only the current system, only the approved ideas. It was standardization taken to its ultimate extreme. Just as currency and measurements had been unified, so too would thought itself be standardized.
The Flames Rise, 213 BCE. The emperor approved Li Si's proposal. The order went out across the empire: surrender your books for burning. Imagine the scene repeated in cities and towns throughout China, officials arriving at homes demanding the surrender of texts, scholars watching as scrolls they had studied for decades were piled in public squares, the smell of smoke as paper and bamboo caught fire, the sight of characters painstakingly written curling and blackening as flames consumed them. Not all books were destroyed. The imperial library in the capital preserved copies of many texts, ostensibly for reference. Books on practical subjects were exempted. And in reality, many people hid books, buried them, concealed them in walls or beneath floors, hoping to preserve them for a future when such knowledge might again be valued. But the damage was immense. Countless unique texts were lost forever. Works of philosophy, history, poetry, entire literary traditions that had developed in the different kingdoms, much of this was reduced to ash. The burning was selective in a way that reveals its true purpose. Books that supported the regime were preserved. Books that might inspire alternatives or foster criticism were destroyed. It was not an attack on knowledge itself, but on dangerous knowledge, on ideas that might threaten the unified system the emperor had created. Li Si argued that this was necessary for stability. As long as people could read about different ways of organizing society, different philosophies of governance, they would question the current system. Eliminate those alternatives, and people would accept what existed because they would know nothing else. It was a chilling logic, one that would be echoed by authoritarian regimes throughout history. Control the past, and you control the future. Limit what people can learn, and you limit what they can imagine.
The Scholar's Fate, 212 BCE. The following year brought even darker events. The emperor had become increasingly paranoid, increasingly convinced that scholars and intellectuals were undermining his authority. Perhaps he heard rumors of criticism, whispers of discontent. Perhaps the book burning had not silenced opposition as thoroughly as he had hoped.
Or perhaps his quest for immortality, which we will explore in a later chapter, had made him suspicious of the scholars and magicians he had surrounded himself with. Whatever the specific trigger, the emperor ordered an investigation. Officials were sent to interrogate scholars, to uncover what they really thought, what they said in private about the regime and its methods. Under interrogation, some scholars apparently confessed to criticizing the emperor. They had called his methods harsh. They had suggested his quest for immortality was futile. They had, in essence, failed to show the absolute loyalty and belief that the system demanded. The emperor's response was terrible. He ordered that over 400 scholars be executed, but not through ordinary means. They were to be buried alive. The location was near the capital. Pits were dug. The scholars, perhaps bound, perhaps not, were forced into these pits and covered with earth. Death would have come slowly, through suffocation, in darkness and terror. It was meant to be a warning, an example of what happened to those who questioned imperial authority. It was meant to intimidate, to silence, to ensure that no one would dare criticize the emperor or his methods. The news of this atrocity spread throughout the empire. Fear settled over the scholarly community. Those who survived learned to keep their thoughts to themselves, to mouth approved platitudes, to study only what was permitted.
Motivation and meaning. Why did the emperor authorize such acts? What drove him to such extremes? The simple answer is control. He had unified China through force, had created an unprecedented centralized state, but physical control was not enough. He wanted to control thought itself, to ensure that no one could even imagine alternatives to his system. The legalist philosophy that guided him taught that order required uniformity. Diverse ideas led to confusion and conflict. If everyone thought the same way, believed the same things, accepted the same truths, society would be stable and harmonious. But there was something else too, something more personal. The emperor was sensitive to criticism, unable to tolerate dissent. The scholars who questioned him, who suggested his methods were flawed, wounded his pride and threatened his self-image. He had accomplished the impossible. He had unified China. Who were these bookish pedants to question him? What had they achieved compared to his conquests? Their criticism was not just wrong, but ungrateful, a failure to recognize his greatness. This combination, the legalist ideology and the personal insecurity, created a toxic mixture that led to cultural catastrophe. Historical controversies. We must pause here to acknowledge that the traditional account of these events, the story as it has been told for millennia, may not be entirely accurate. The main source for these events is Sima Qian, the great historian who wrote during the Han Dynasty, about a century after Qin's fall. Sima Qian had reasons to portray the first emperor negatively. The Han Dynasty had replaced Qin and needed to justify that replacement by emphasizing Qin's cruelty and failures. Some modern scholars suggest that the book burning may have been less comprehensive than traditionally depicted. Perhaps it targeted specific texts rather than attempting to destroy all non-technical books. Perhaps local officials implemented the orders less zealously than the court intended. The burial of scholars is even more controversial. Some historians question whether it happened at all, or whether the story was exaggerated or invented to blacken the emperor's reputation. Others point out that while the event may have occurred, the victims might have been alchemists and magicians rather than Confucian scholars, a distinction that matters less morally but changes the historical context. We cannot know with absolute certainty what happened. The sources are distant, potentially biased, and sometimes contradictory. But what we can say is this: whether the traditional account is entirely accurate or partially exaggerated, something terrible happened. Books were burned in large numbers. Scholars were killed or silenced. Intellectual freedom was suppressed. The regime attempted to control thought through violence and intimidation. The exact numbers and details may be debated, but the essential truth of cultural repression is undeniable.
The long shadow. The burning of books and punishment of scholars cast a shadow over everything else Qin Shi Huang accomplished. The roads he built, the walls he raised, the empire he unified. All of these achievements are remembered alongside the flames that consumed ancient wisdom and the earth that buried living men. For Chinese intellectuals across the subsequent millennia, these acts became symbols of everything wrong with authoritarian rule. They represented the fear of knowledge, the suppression of free thought, the danger of concentrating too much power in one person's hands. Later dynasties would claim to value scholarship and learning, at least in part as a reaction against Qin's excesses. The Confucian texts that the first emperor tried to destroy would be reconstructed, revered, made central to Chinese education and culture. But the fear remained. The knowledge that a ruler could, if he chose, attempt to erase the past, silence dissent, control the very thoughts of his subjects. That fear would resurface again and again in Chinese history, whenever rulers grew too powerful and intellectuals too critical. Breathe slowly now. Let the weight of this chapter settle. It is a heavy burden, this knowledge of what fear and power can do when combined. The emperor, in his palace, surrounded by officials who now knew the cost of criticism, had achieved a kind of silence. But it was the silence of the graveyard, the quiet of suppressed truth rather than genuine harmony. He had built so much, and yet in these acts of destruction, he had also lost something. Perhaps he had lost the mandate of heaven that he claimed. Perhaps he had lost the moral authority that might have made his dynasty endure. Or perhaps he simply revealed what had been true all along, that his empire was built on force, maintained through fear, and would collapse the moment that force and fear could no longer be sustained. The flames that consumed the books would eventually consume the dynasty itself. But that end was still ahead, still hidden in a future the emperor could not imagine. For now, he turned his attention elsewhere, to a quest even more ambitious than unifying China. He would attempt to conquer death itself.
In March of 1974, farmers were digging a well near the city of Xi'an in central China. The land was dry, the harvest had been poor, and the commune needed water for irrigation. The farmers drove their shovels into the earth, excavating deeper and deeper into the soil. And then they struck something unexpected, something hard, pottery shards perhaps. But as they cleared more earth away, shapes emerged. A head, a torso, arms raised as if holding something long vanished. They had discovered a warrior, life-sized, made of terracotta clay, buried for more than 2,000 years. What they could not have known, what no one could have imagined, was the scale of what lay beneath their feet. They had found the edge of one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries in human history, an underground army, 8,000 strong, waiting in darkness for an emperor who would never return. The Mausoleum Project. When Qin Shi Huang unified China in 221 before the Common Era, he was 38 years old. He had accomplished what no one before him had managed, but he had no intention of stopping. He would rule his empire, yes, but he would also prepare for what came after. He was not content with the normal preparations for death. Other rulers built tombs, to be sure, impressive structures that would house their remains and demonstrate their status even in the afterlife. But the first emperor wanted something unprecedented, something that matched the scope of his achievements in life. He wanted an eternal empire, a realm that would continue in the afterlife, complete with all the trappings of power and authority he had commanded in the living world. The location chosen was near Mount Li, outside the capital.
Work began even before the unification was complete, and it continued throughout the remaining years of the emperor's life. Some sources suggest that 700,000 workers labored on the tomb complex at various points, though this number may be exaggerated. The tomb itself, the burial mound where the emperor's body would rest, was constructed as an artificial mountain. Earth was piled high, creating a pyramid-shaped hill that dominated the landscape. Beneath this mountain, workers excavated a vast underground palace. Ancient sources, particularly the historian Sima Qian, describe the interior in terms that sound almost mythical. A ceiling decorated to represent the heavens, with pearls positioned to depict stars. A floor carved to show the geography of the empire, with rivers of mercury flowing through miniature landscapes. Crossbows set as traps to kill any who might try to enter the tomb. Treasures beyond counting. Everything the emperor might need in the afterlife. How much of this description is accurate? We may never know, because the central tomb has never been opened. It remains sealed, a mystery waiting beneath the earth. But what we do know about, what we can see with our own eyes, is the army.
The discovery and excavation. When those farmers discovered the first fragments in 1974, archaeologists quickly realized the significance. Excavations began, careful and methodical, revealing more and more of what lay beneath. They found not just scattered statues, but organized formations, ranks of soldiers standing in military order, officers distinguishable by their uniforms, archers in kneeling positions, cavalry with horses, charioteers standing in bronze chariots. The site was divided into pits, numbered as they were discovered. Pit 1 was the largest, containing an estimated 6,000 warriors arranged in battle formation. Pit 2 held cavalry and infantry units. Pit 3 appeared to be a command post with high-ranking officers and a chariot. And every single warrior was unique. No two faces were identical. Each had been individually crafted, given distinct features, expressions, ages. Some looked young, barely more than boys. Others appeared weathered, veterans of many campaigns. Some had mustaches or beards, others were clean-shaven. Their hair was styled differently, their postures varied slightly. It was as if the sculptor had captured actual soldiers, preserving their individuality even as they stood in formation, frozen for eternity. The level of detail was extraordinary. You could see the treads on the soles of their shoes, the texture of their armor, each plate carefully rendered. The knots tying their sashes, the fingers curled as if they had once held real weapons. Those weapons made of bronze were found scattered among the warriors. Swords, crossbows, spears, halberds, real weapons, carefully forged, placed in the statue's hands. Many had corroded over the millennia, but some were found in remarkable condition, still sharp after more than 2,000 years. The warriors had originally been painted. Traces of pigment found on some statues reveal that they wore bright colors: red, green, purple, blue. They would have looked almost alive, standing in their underground chambers, a riot of color in the darkness. But exposure to air caused the paint to flake and fade within minutes of excavation. Early archaeologists watched helplessly as colors that had survived for millennia vanished before their eyes. Later excavations employed better preservation techniques, but much of the original vibrancy was lost.
The meaning and purpose. Why did the emperor create this underground army? What purpose did these clay soldiers serve? In ancient Chinese belief, death was not an ending, but a transition. The deceased continued to exist in the afterlife, and they needed the same things in death that they had required in life: food, shelter, servants, protection. For a warrior, the afterlife might be dangerous. There might be threats to guard against, enemies to fight. And for an emperor, a man who had conquered China and created an empire, the afterlife would presumably involve ruling, and ruling required an army. The Terracotta warriors were, in essence, the emperor's eternal bodyguard. They would protect him in death as his living armies had served him in life. They would ensure that he remained powerful and defended even in the realm beyond. But there was another dimension to this. The army represented the emperor's achievements. He had unified China through military conquest. His armies had defeated 6 kingdoms. The clay soldiers standing in formation were a monument to that victory, a permanent reminder of his power. They were also a substitute for something much darker. In ancient times, when powerful rulers died, it was not uncommon for their servants and soldiers to be killed and buried with them. A ruler needed attendants in the afterlife, and the most reliable way to ensure their service was to send them there. The first emperor could easily have ordered hundreds or thousands of living soldiers to accompany him in death. That he chose clay substitutes instead might be seen as mercy, or at least pragmatism. Why waste valuable soldiers when clay replicas could serve the same symbolic purpose? The artistry and labor. Creating 8,000 unique terracotta warriors was an undertaking that required sophisticated organization and artistic skill. The work was divided among many craftsmen. Some specialized in heads, sculpting faces with individual features. Others crafted bodies, legs, arms. Still others made the armor and clothing details. The pieces were then assembled, and the whole statue was fired in enormous kilns. The kilns themselves were engineering marvels, large enough to fire life-size statues at temperatures that would turn clay into stone-hard terracotta. Workshops must have operated continuously, producing warriors year after year. It was a kind of mass production, but with individual artistry preserved in each piece. Who were these craftsmen? What did they think as they shaped clay into the faces of warriors? Did they understand the significance of what they were creating? Did they take pride in their work? Or was it just another imperial project, another demand from a ruler who seemed to require the impossible? We know that the craftsmen signed some pieces, marking their work with stamps or inscriptions. This suggests pride, or at least a desire for their contribution to be recognized. Each signature was a small assertion of individuality, a whisper across millennia saying, "I made this. I was here."
What lies beneath? The terracotta army is what we can see, what has been excavated and preserved in museums, but it represents only a fraction of the tomb complex. The burial mound itself, the artificial mountain where the emperor's body presumably rests, has never been opened. It sits there, a massive presence on the landscape, holding secrets that modern archaeology has chosen not to disturb. Why not open it? Partly out of respect, the feeling that disturbing a tomb, even one more than 2,000 years old, should not be done lightly. Partly out of concern about preservation. The treasures inside might deteriorate rapidly if exposed to air, just as the warrior's paint did. But also because of what might be inside. Sima Qian's description mentions mercury rivers, and modern soil tests around the mound have revealed unusually high mercury concentrations. If the tomb really does contain large quantities of mercury, opening it could be dangerous. The crossbow traps mentioned in ancient sources might sound like fantasy, but Qin's craftsmen certainly knew how to make such mechanisms. The tomb might genuinely be booby-trapped. So, the central chamber remains sealed, its contents unknown. Geophysical surveys suggest there are indeed large chambers beneath the mound. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed anomalies that might be structures or voids. But what exactly lies there? The emperor's body in a bronze coffin? Treasures piled high? The mercury rivers and pearl stars described in the histories? We can only speculate. And perhaps that's fitting. The emperor wanted to create an eternal realm, and in a sense, he succeeded. His tomb remains inviolate,
its mysteries preserved, a piece of the past that the present cannot quite reach. The army in context. When you visit the excavated pits today, now housed in museum buildings constructed around them, the sight is overwhelming. Row after row of warriors stand in their original positions, facing east, ready to march. The gaps where warriors are still buried or being restored only emphasize the vastness of the formation. The silence is profound. These soldiers have stood here for more than 2,000 years, waiting for an emperor who never came, guarding a tomb that remained undisturbed for millennia. They represent the emperor's power and his hubris, his achievements and his fears. He built an empire and believed he could extend it into eternity. He commanded in life and wanted to command in death. But they also represent something about human nature, about the desire to be remembered, to leave something permanent behind. The emperor is dust now, and his dynasty fell within years of his death. But the army remains, more intact than his empire ever was. In their clay faces, we see reflections of the actual soldiers who served the emperor. These were real people, with hopes and fears, families and stories. The sculptors captured something of their humanity, even as they created monuments to imperial power. The terracotta warriors have become symbols of China itself, one of the most recognizable archaeological treasures in the world. Millions of visitors have gazed upon them, marveling at their craftsmanship and the ambition they represent. They were meant to serve the emperor in death. Instead, they serve history, offering us a window into a world long vanished, a glimpse of the empire that shaped China. Let the image rest in your mind now. See the warriors standing in their underground chambers, light falling on faces that have known only darkness for 2 millennia. See the details, the individual expressions, the careful craftsmanship, the weapons they once held. They wait still, these clay soldiers, patient, eternal, guardians not of an emperor long gone, but of memory itself. The emperor wanted to conquer death, to extend his reign beyond the mortal world. The terracotta army was part of that quest, a bid for immortality through grandeur and artistry. But immortality, as we shall see, was not so easily achieved. The emperor would pursue it through other means as well, stranger and more desperate methods that would ultimately fail. Yet, in an ironic way, he did achieve a form of immortality. Through the monuments he built, the empire he created, and especially through this underground army that has captured imaginations across the world, Qin Shi Huang lives on. Not in the afterlife he imagined, but in memory, in history, in the clay faces of 8,000 warriors standing eternal watch beneath the earth of China.
The emperor had conquered China. He had unified warring kingdoms, built roads and walls, standardized everything from writing to currency. He commanded millions. His word was law across distances that would take months to traverse. But there was one enemy he could not defeat, one border he could not cross, one realm that remained beyond his power: death. And Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, the man who had achieved the impossible, could not accept that this final boundary was impassable. If he had unified China through will and determination, why couldn't he conquer mortality itself? This obsession would consume his later years. It would lead him on strange journeys, cause him to consume dangerous substances, and ultimately contribute to his downfall. But it also reveals something deeply human about the man behind the imperial title: his fear, his desperation, his inability to accept that even an emperor must eventually die. The fear takes root.
When exactly did the emperor become obsessed with immortality? Perhaps it began after the unification, when he realized he had achieved everything mortal ambition could accomplish. Perhaps it grew from the constant threat of assassination, the knowledge that despite all his power, a single blade could end everything. Or perhaps, most likely, it developed gradually, a concern about death that grew into preoccupation, then obsession, then desperate quest. Ancient Chinese philosophy offered the possibility of extending life, even achieving immortality through various means. Taoist alchemists claimed to know secrets of transformation, ways to refine the body and spirit until they transcended mortality. They spoke of immortals living in remote mountains or distant islands, beings who had discovered the secrets of eternal life. The emperor, surrounded by advisors and scholars, would have heard these stories, and unlike most people who might listen with skeptical interest, he had the resources to investigate. He could send expeditions to distant lands. He could command the best alchemists to work exclusively on extending his life. He could afford to pursue immortality in ways that ordinary mortals could never attempt. So he did. The alchemists and their promises. The court became populated with alchemists, magicians, and supposed wise men who claimed knowledge of life extension. They came from different regions, each with their own theories and methods, all promising the emperor what he desperately wanted to hear. These were not simple charlatans, or at least not all of them. Many genuinely believed in their theories, which were based on sophisticated philosophical systems. They understood the world through concepts like yin and yang, the 5 elements, the circulation of qi, energy or vital force, through the body. They believed that by consuming certain substances, performing certain exercises, maintaining certain diets, a person could refine their physical form into something more durable, less subject to decay and death. The problem was that many of these substances were poisonous. Alchemists favored minerals and metals in their preparations, particularly those that seemed eternal or unchanging. Gold never tarnished, so surely consuming gold in some refined form would grant immortality. Jade was prized as a precious stone, associated with purity and permanence. Cinnabar, a red mercury sulfide, was considered especially powerful because of its vibrant color and its connection to mercury. They created elaborate concoctions, heating and refining these substances through complex processes meant to purify them and unlock their life-extending properties. The emperor consumed these preparations, trusting that the alchemist's knowledge would protect him. But mercury is poison. Cinnabar is toxic. The very substances meant to grant eternal life were slowly killing him. Did the alchemists know this? Probably not in most cases. They genuinely believed their theories. When the emperor showed signs of illness after taking their preparations, they likely attributed it to impurities in the mixture or improper dosage, not to the fundamental toxicity of the substances themselves. Some alchemists, realizing that their promises were not being fulfilled, fled the court before they could be punished for failure. Others made increasingly elaborate excuses, claiming they needed rare ingredients from distant lands or that the emperor needed to perform certain rituals before the elixirs would work. The search for the Isles of the Immortals. Among the legends the emperor heard was a particularly enticing one. Somewhere in the Eastern Sea, there were 3 islands where immortals lived. These islands, called Penglai, Fengzhang, and Yingzhou, were said to be paradises where magic herbs grew that could grant eternal life. Many had sought these islands, but they were protected by mysterious forces. Sometimes they appeared visible on the horizon, but when ships approached, mists would rise or winds would blow, keeping the islands forever out of reach. The emperor wanted these islands found. He wanted the herbs they supposedly contained. In 219 before the Common Era, a man named Shu Fu came to the emperor with a proposal. He claimed to know the location of these islands and offered to lead an expedition to find them and retrieve the elixir of immortality. The emperor, desperate for anything that might grant him eternal life, approved the expedition lavishly. Xu Fu was given ships, thousands of young men and women to accompany him, supplies, and treasures to trade if necessary. The expedition set sail, heading east into the unknown waters beyond China. And it never returned. Years passed. The emperor waited. No word came from Xu Fu. Had the expedition found the islands? Had they all perished at sea? Had Xu Fu simply taken the emperor's resources and established himself somewhere beyond imperial reach? The emperor sent more expeditions, searching for Xu Fu or for the islands themselves. All failed to return any evidence of immortal realms or life-extending herbs. Modern speculation suggests that Xu Fu may have reached Japan, and some Japanese legends speak of a Chinese explorer arriving during this period. If true, Xu Fu may have chosen to stay rather than return empty-handed to an emperor who would not tolerate failure. But the emperor never learned what became of his expedition. The ships vanished into the Eastern Sea, taking with them his hopes of finding a magical solution to mortality.
The inspection tours and their true purpose. The emperor's inspection tours throughout his empire, traveling to distant provinces to oversee administration and demonstrate his power, had another motivation. He was searching for the secret of immortality. He visited sacred mountains, places where legends said immortals had achieved enlightenment. He performed rituals at these sites, hoping to connect with spiritual forces that might grant him extended life. He sought out hermits and wise men, rumored to have unusual longevity. He questioned them about their secrets, hoping to learn techniques or knowledge that his court alchemists had missed. These journeys were exhausting, requiring the emperor to travel thousands of miles through difficult terrain. But he persisted, driven by the belief that somewhere, somehow, the secret existed and could be found. On one of these journeys, he climbed Mount Tai, the most sacred mountain in China, to perform the Feng and Shan sacrifices. These ancient rituals connected rulers to heaven and earth. The emperor hoped they might also grant him divine favor, perhaps even the gift of immortality. But mountains and rituals did not stop aging. The years passed and the emperor grew older. His health began to decline, likely accelerated by the mercury and other poisons he had been consuming. Mercury and madness. Mercury held a special fascination for ancient alchemists. It was a metal that flowed like water, liquid at room temperature, seeming to embody transformation and fluidity. It was associated with quicksilver, with change, with transcendence of normal physical boundaries. Cinnabar, the bright red mercury sulfide, was ground into powder and consumed. Pure mercury was used in various preparations. The emperor's tomb was said to contain rivers of flowing mercury, not just symbolically, but literally, tons of the substance beneath the burial mound. Chronic mercury poisoning produces distinctive symptoms: tremors, mood instability, insomnia, memory loss, irritability. It can cause both physical and mental deterioration. Did the emperor's increasing paranoia in his later years stem partly from mercury poisoning? His willingness to execute scholars, his growing suspicion of advisors, his erratic decision-making, were these influenced by toxins accumulating in his body? We cannot know for certain, but it seems likely. The man who had been calculating and methodical in his conquests became more unpredictable, more prone to extreme actions. The substances meant to grant him eternal life were destroying his mind, even as they damaged his body. The alchemists, meanwhile, continued their work.
If the emperor showed signs of illness, they prescribed more elaborate preparations, higher doses, rarer ingredients. The cure for mercury poisoning was more mercury, refined in different ways. It was a slow suicide dressed up as the pursuit of eternal life.
The irony and the tragedy. There is a profound irony in the emperor's quest for immortality. He built monuments that would last millennia: the Great Wall, the roads, the Terracotta Army. These achievements granted him a form of immortality, his name remembered across centuries. But he wanted more than memory. He wanted to continue existing, to keep ruling, to never surrender his power and consciousness to the void. And in that quest, he consumed poisons that hastened his death. The very pursuit of eternal life shortened the life he had. There is tragedy too. Qin Shi Huang had achieved extraordinary things. He had unified China, created systems that would influence governance for thousands of years, demonstrated capabilities that seemed almost superhuman. But he could not accept the limits of mortality. Perhaps if he had accepted death as inevitable, he might have spent his later years consolidating his empire, ensuring its stability, preparing his successor. Perhaps the Qin dynasty might have lasted beyond his death if he had focused on building enduring institutions rather than seeking impossible immortality. Instead, he chased illusions. He trusted charlatans. He consumed poisons. He sent expeditions on futile quests. He became obsessed with the one thing he could not control or conquer. It reveals the fundamental humanity beneath the imperial title. For all his power, for all his achievements, Qin Shi Huang was a man, and like all men, he feared death. Unlike most men, he had the resources to act on that fear in spectacular and ultimately self-destructive ways.
The final irony. The emperor's quest for immortality would end in death, but not before one final journey, one last inspection tour that would take him far from his capital. He would die on that journey, far from home, his quest unfulfilled. The elixirs had failed. The expeditions had found nothing. The rituals and ceremonies had not granted eternal life. All the power in China, all the resources of the empire, all the alchemists and their preparations, none of it could stop the inevitable. The man who could not be defeated in battle, who conquered kingdoms and built wonders, would be defeated by biology, by time, by the simple fact that bodies wear out and cease functioning. His death, when it came, would be kept secret. His ministers would conspire to hide it, to maintain the illusion of imperial power even after the emperor had ceased to exist. The body would be transported back to the capital in secrecy, with fish loaded in carts to disguise the smell of decay. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. That story comes next. For now, understand this. The emperor's quest for immortality defined his later years, and in many ways destroyed what he had built. The obsession consumed him, distracted him from governance, led him to trust dangerous people and consume deadly substances. He built an underground army to serve him in the afterlife, but he wanted more. He wanted to never reach that afterlife, to remain in the world of the living forever. It was the one conquest he could not achieve, the one wall he could not build, the one enemy he could not defeat. And in the end, mortality would claim him as it claims everyone. Emperor and peasant alike, all returned to the earth. In the autumn of 210 before the Common Era, the first emperor set out on what would be his last inspection tour. He was 49 years old, and the years weighed heavily upon him. The elixirs had not granted immortality. The expeditions had returned empty-handed, or not at all. Time, the enemy he could not conquer, was winning.
But he would not remain idle in his palace. He would travel, as he had done so many times before, through the empire he had created. He would demonstrate his power, inspect his officials, visit sacred sites. Perhaps, somewhere on this journey, he might still find what he had been seeking. He traveled east, toward the sea. His entourage was enormous, as always, thousands of officials, guards, servants. The imperial procession stretched for miles, a demonstration of power and authority that announced itself long before the emperor's carriage came into view. They visited coastal regions where legends spoke of the immortal islands. Perhaps the emperor still hoped to see them, those mythical paradises that Xu Fu had promised to find. The horizon remained empty, revealing nothing but sea and sky. They turned north, following the coast. The weather grew hot. It was summer now, and the sealed carriage that transported the emperor became stifling. But protocol demanded that the emperor remain hidden from common view, separated from ordinary people by curtains and screens. In the 7th month of that year, the procession reached a place called Shaqiu, in what had been the kingdom of Zhao. It was a palace complex where the emperor could rest, recover from the rigors of travel. It was here that death finally caught up with him.
Death in Shaqiu. The sources do not agree on the exact cause of death. Some suggest illness, perhaps exacerbated by the mercury and other toxins he had been consuming for years. Others hint at the cumulative effects of chronic poisoning. His body, weakened by substances meant to preserve it, simply gave out. Perhaps he felt the end approaching. Perhaps he knew in those final hours that all his efforts to escape mortality had failed. Or perhaps death came suddenly, without warning, catching even the emperor by surprise. We know only this. Qin Shi Huang died in Shaqiu, far from his capital, surrounded by a small inner circle of advisors. Among those present were Li Si, his long-serving chancellor, and Zhao Gao, a powerful eunuch who served as the emperor's chief minister. These two men would make a decision that would shape what happened next. The emperor had not clearly designated a successor. He had an eldest son, Fusu, who was capable and respected. Fusu had been sent to the northern frontier to oversee the Great Wall's construction and assist General Meng Tian. He was away from the capital, away from the court's intrigues. The emperor also had a younger son, Hu Hai, who was with the procession. Hu Hai was weak, easily influenced, and had been indulged by his father. He would make a poor emperor, and most officials knew it. But Zhao Gao had his own agenda. He had cultivated a relationship with Hu Hai and saw in the young prince someone he could control. If Hu Hai became emperor, Zhao Gao would effectively rule the empire. Li Si, the pragmatic chancellor who had served Qin Shi Huang for decades, faced a choice: support the rightful heir Fusu, or join Zhao Gao's conspiracy and place Hu Hai on the throne. He chose power over principle. Perhaps he reasoned that stability required a quick succession, that recalling Fusu from the frontier would create dangerous delay. Perhaps he simply wanted to maintain his own position. Whatever his motivation, Li Si agreed to the conspiracy. But first, they had to deal with an immediate problem. The emperor was dead, and they were far from the capital. The concealment. The death could not be announced. Not yet. Not here. If word spread that the emperor had died while traveling, chaos might erupt. Provincial governors might declare independence. Rivals might seize power. The empire, so carefully constructed, might fragment in the power vacuum. So Li Si and Zhao Gao decided to conceal the death. They would pretend the emperor still lived until they could return to the capital and control the succession. The emperor's body was placed in his traveling carriage, the one with sealed compartments that prevented anyone from seeing inside. Food was brought to the carriage as usual.
Officials came to receive orders which were delivered by Zhao Gao and Li Si, supposedly conveying the emperor's will. The procession continued its journey, traveling now toward the capital. But summer heat was unrelenting, and inside that sealed carriage, a body was decomposing. The smell became impossible to hide. The stench of decay seeped through the carriage walls, announcing to anyone nearby that something was terribly wrong. The conspirators' solution was grimly practical. They loaded a cart with salted fish and positioned it near the emperor's carriage. The overwhelming smell of fish masked the odor of the decomposing body. Anyone who noticed the stench would attribute it to the fish cart, not to the death of the emperor. So the procession continued. The dead emperor traveled through his empire one last time, hidden in his carriage, accompanied by rotting fish. Officials and common people alike watched the procession pass, unaware that they were witnessing not imperial power, but an elaborate deception. The Forged Letter. As the procession traveled, Li Si and Zhao Gao put the rest of their plan into motion. They forged a letter in the emperor's name addressed to Fu Su. The letter was brutal and false. It claimed that Fu Su had failed in his duties on the northern frontier. It accused him of incompetence and disloyalty, and it commanded him to commit suicide. A similar letter was sent to General Meng Tian, ordering him to end his own life as well. When the letters arrived, Fu Su was devastated. His father, whom he had served loyally, was commanding his death. Fu Su, raised to obey imperial orders without question, prepared to kill himself. Meng Tian, more experienced and suspicious, urged Fu Su to verify the order, to request confirmation, to at least question whether this command was genuine. But Fu Su would not disobey what he believed to be his father's final order. He committed suicide, removing himself as an obstacle to Zhao Gao's plan. Meng Tian, refusing to follow suit, was imprisoned. He would later be executed, eliminating another potential threat to the new regime. With Fu Su dead and Meng Tian neutralized, the path was clear for Hu Hai. The Return and Revelation. The procession finally reached the capital. Only then, when they were safely within the palace complex and could control the announcement, did Li Si and Zhao Gao reveal that the emperor had died. The news must have shocked the court, though the inner circle likely suspected something when the emperor failed to appear after returning from the journey. The body was prepared for burial according to ritual. The massive tomb that had been under construction for decades was ready to receive its eternal occupant. Hu Hai was proclaimed the second emperor, Shi Huangdi. The dynasty would continue as Qin Shi Huang had intended, though not in the way he might have hoped. The first emperor was interred in his mountain tomb, surrounded by treasures, protected by his terracotta army, lying beneath rivers of mercury in an underground palace that mimicked his earthly realm. He had sought immortality and achieved only death. He had built an empire and left it to a weak successor manipulated by conspirators. His final journey had ended not in triumph, but in deception and decay. Aftermath of betrayal. The conspiracy that began at Shakyu would have devastating consequences. Hu Hai, the second emperor, proved exactly as incompetent as expected. Zhao Gao dominated him, using the young emperor as a puppet while accumulating power for himself. Li Si, who had betrayed his principles to maintain his position, soon learned the cost of that choice. Zhao Gao, no longer needing the chancellor, turned against him. Li Si was arrested, tortured, and executed, cut in half at the waist in the marketplace, a humiliating end for a man who had shaped an empire. The government descended into paranoia and cruelty. Taxes increased, punishments became harsher. The systems that Qin Shi Huang had established were applied with brutal rigidity, but without his guiding intelligence. And across the empire, Resentment that had been building for years began to boil over. The peasants who had labored on the Great Wall, who had paid heavy taxes, who had endured conscription and forced relocation, they had tolerated these burdens under a strong emperor who delivered order and unity. But under a weak successor, under obvious misrule, the tolerance ended. Rebellions began to spark, small at first, then growing, spreading like fire across dry graphs. The Qin dynasty, which the first emperor had believed would last 10,000 generations, was entering its final days.
The last irony. Qin Shi Huang had died seeking immortality. He had consumed poisons meant to extend his life. He had sent expeditions to find magical islands. He had built a tomb meant to house him for eternity. But his dynasty would not survive him by even 2 decades. Everything he built, all the systems and structures, would collapse under his successor's incompetence and the conspirators' corruption. His final journey, that last inspection tour, revealed the ultimate futility of his quest. All the power in the world could not stop death. All the precautions could not prevent betrayal. All the grand plans could not ensure that his vision would outlast him. He traveled home as a corpse, hidden behind curtains, accompanied by rotting fish, while those he had trusted plotted to subvert his legacy. It was an undignified end for a man who had demanded absolute dignity in life, a humiliating concealment for an emperor whose power had seemed absolute. But perhaps in that final journey there was also a kind of truth, the truth that emperors and commoners alike are mortal, that power is temporary, that control is always an illusion, maintained only so long as the person exercising it continues to breathe. Qin Shi Huang returned to his capital one last time, to be buried in the tomb he had prepared, to begin an afterlife he had tried so desperately to avoid. The first emperor was dead, and now we must witness what he could not prevent, the rapid, tragic collapse of everything he had built.